The Edwardian era was a curious paradox. On one hand, Britain strutted confidently across the globe like a well-dressed peacock, feathers polished, tail fanned wide. On the other, at home it was nervously peering over its shoulder, terrified that if women got the vote, civilization might collapse faster than a poorly built Victorian bridge. The period from 1901 to 1910, stretching a little beyond the reign of King Edward VII, is remembered as a time of elegance, empire, and endless tea. It was also a moment when Britain looked powerful from the outside, but was busy wrestling with questions of who exactly got to count as a citizen on the inside. Spoiler, if you were a woman, the answer was a polite but firm absolutely not. Hello travellers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you're listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's start with the empire itself. Edwardian Britain wasn't just a country, it was practically an international brand. Half the world map was shaded in pink to mark British territories, and London boasted of being the workshop of the world. If you wanted to look fashionable, read newspapers that mattered, or get invited to dinner parties where someone inevitably played a dreadful violin, London was the place. This was the heart of global finance, trade and snobbery. Trains crisscrossed the land, telegraphs clicked out news across continents, and motor cars, the flashy new toys of the wealthy, were just beginning to roar down the roads, frightening horses and pedestrians alike. At the very top of society was King Edward VII, a monarch who loved cigars, champagne and women almost as much as he loved ignoring actual political work. His reign was shorter than his waistline was wide, but his taste for leisure, fashion and continental manners set the tone for the elite. The Edwardian high society was all about glittering soirees, extravagant hats so big they could double as parasols, and garden parties where people pretended to discuss art, but mostly gossiped about who was scandalously involved with whom. Yet beneath all this sparkle, Britain was full of contradictions. The Industrial Revolution had created enormous wealth, but it also left behind soot-stained factory towns and working-class families who had never even seen a cucumber sandwich, let alone tasted one. While aristocrats dined on multiple courses of game, fish and puddings, the poor often made do with bread, tea and prayers that the landlord wouldn't evict them. This glaring inequality didn't go unnoticed. Social reformers, trade unions and political radicals were stirring up debates about poverty, health and education. But when women raised their hands and said, "Excuse us, may we also have a voice in politics?" the answer was still, "Darling, no, do sit down and pour the tea." Tea, of course, was central to Edwardian Britain. It wasn't just a drink, it was practically a national identity. Afternoon tea was the social glue that held polite society together. Parlours buzzed with gossip, while cups clinked on saucers, and cakes mysteriously vanished in quantities far larger than anyone admitted. Yet for all their obsession with tea, Edwardians couldn't seem to swallow the idea of women having a say in how the country was run. Britain could micromanage colonies halfway across the globe, but somehow found the idea of female voters utterly unmanageable. Or, as one anti-suffrage cartoon suggested, allowing women to vote would result in babies being neglected, dinners burned, and heaven forbid, husbands forced to make their own toast. The political system of the time was carefully constructed to keep power in male hands. Parliament was the playground of wealthy men, and the rules of the game were written by, for, and about them. Women could own property, thanks to late Victorian reforms, run households and contribute to taxes, but when it came to casting a vote, they were treated like decorative plants. Lovely to look at, but not to be taken seriously. Imagine telling a woman who managed an entire estate, including staff, tenants and accounts, that she couldn't possibly understand how to select an MP. It would be laughable if it weren't so insulting. Actually, it was both. And let's not forget the Edwardian obsession with appearances. Manners mattered more than practicality. This was a society where hats had their own gravitational pull, corsets could snap ribs, and men carried walking sticks they didn't need, simply because they looked authoritative. Everything was about order, control, and tradition. Giving women political power, that sounded as chaotic as letting the butler sit at the dining table. Technology, however, was pushing the country forward, whether it wanted to move or not. Electricity was creeping into homes, motor cars were replacing horses, and cinema was thrilling audiences with flickering images of things they'd never seen before. Yet in politics, progress was crawling. The Edwardians could imagine flying machines in the sky, but not women in the voting booth. Britain was modernising in every way except in admitting that half the population might have ideas worth voting on. For all its elegance and glamour, Edwardian Britain was a pressure cooker. Class tensions, labour strikes, Irish nationalism and the women's movement all bubbled beneath the surface, threatening to boil over, and they did, in spectacular ways. But in 1901, as Edward VII settled onto his throne with a cigar in hand, the establishment still believed it had everything under control. Women, after all, could host dazzling dinner parties, raise impeccable children, and maintain social order by wearing enough fabric to wallpaper a small house. Why on earth would they need the vote? The irony of Edwardian Britain was simple. Here was a nation that could project power across oceans, invent dazzling technologies, and dominate world culture, yet trembled at the idea of giving its own women a piece of paper and a pencil to tick a box. Or, to put it more bluntly, Britain could rule half the globe but couldn't imagine women ruling a ballot box. When Edwardian politicians talked about the suffragette problem, they didn't mean a minor nuisance like traffic jams caused by horse manure or the occasional pigeon making deposits on a statue of Queen Victoria. No, this problem was existential, or at least that's how they described it. To many men in power, women demanding the vote wasn't simply a question, it was the social equivalent of an earthquake. Civilization, they insisted, would crack apart if women got a say at the ballot box. It's worth remembering that, in Edwardian Britain, politics was considered a man's natural domain. The House of Commons was full of men debating taxes, empire, and railway policies, with the seriousness of priests reciting sacred rites. Allowing women into this sacred brotherhood was viewed as akin to letting a fox into a henhouse, or worse, letting the hens start making the rules for the fox. The very phrase women's suffrage carried with it the whiff of chaos, the sense that the natural order of things was about to be upended, and politicians really didn't like the idea of things being upended. They already had enough trouble with Irish nationalists, restless workers, and the occasional scandal involving champagne and chorus girls. So why exactly did men call it a problem? Let's take their arguments one at a time. First, there was the argument from tradition. Politics was, and always had been, a man's affair. Women were the angels of the house, guardians of morality, child-rearing and cucumber sandwiches. To let them vote would be like allowing your teapot to suddenly develop opinions on foreign policy. Politicians solemnly claimed that the natural balance of society would be overturned if women stopped focusing on the home and started worrying about elections. In their minds, the country would collapse the moment dinner was burned because mother was at a rally. Second, there was the argument from incompetence. Many men genuinely believed women weren't clever enough to understand politics. These were the same men who regularly fell asleep in Parliament after a heavy lunch. But consistency has never been a strong suit of sexism. Women, they said, were ruled by their emotions, while men were creatures of logic and reason. The fact that men frequently started wars over wounded pride or territorial squabbles was quietly ignored. According to the political establishment, women would vote based on feelings rather than facts, which is ironic since much of Edwardian political debate was basically shouting, finger-pointing and red-faced emotion disguised as policy. Third, there was the argument from disaster. Granting women the vote would open the floodgates to demands from every other marginalised group. If women could vote, why not servants, colonial subjects, or heaven forbid, cats? Yes, some critics genuinely feared the slippery slope of equality. Today it sounds ridiculous, but Edwardian newspapers printed cartoons warning that letting women vote would lead to total anarchy. Babies crawling into polling stations, dogs demanding representation, and husbands weeping because their wives voted for the other party. And then, of course, there was the argument from masculinity. Men claimed they were protecting women by excluding them. Politics, they said, was a dirty business, too rough and cruel for delicate female minds. Women, they argued, would be tarnished by exposure to its corruption. Better to keep them innocent, pure, and safely busy with embroidery. This was less about kindness than about control. After all, if women entered politics, they might discover just how badly men were running things, and that was far too dangerous. The problem of suffrage, then, wasn't really about women at all. It was about men protecting their monopoly on power. The Edwardian establishment wasn't prepared to admit it, so they dressed their objections up in moral, scientific, and even religious language. Clergymen thundered from pulpits that women voting was against God's will. Pseudoscientists published evidence that female brains were smaller and thus incapable of reasoned political judgment, ignoring the fact that these same scientists often forgot to wear matching socks. Newspapers ran editorials warning that suffrage would spell the end of marriage, family, and empire. What's striking is how fear shaped the debate. Men in Parliament seemed less worried about what women would actually do with the vote, and more terrified of what the symbolism meant. The vote was power, it was recognition, it was citizenship. To extend it to women meant admitting they were equals, and that idea made many men profoundly uncomfortable. For all the grandeur of Edwardian Britain, the empire, the industry, the elegance, its ruling class trembled at the thought of women scribbling an X on a ballot paper. The language politicians used is almost comical today. They described women voting as if it were a plague, a flood, or a foreign invasion. One MP likened suffragettes to a horde of barbarians, suggesting that their political ambitions were as dangerous as Visigoths at the gates of Rome. Another solemnly declared that granting suffrage would destroy the English race, which seems a bit melodramatic for something that, in reality, just meant women wanted to choose between two equally uninspiring candidates. To the Edwardian establishment, then, the suffragette problem wasn't merely about laws, it was about identity. They feared a Britain where women had power, where traditional hierarchies were questioned, and where politics wasn't just a gentleman's club. The word problem reveals everything. They saw women not as participants in democracy, but as obstacles to be managed, ridiculed, or repressed. And that fear was the fuel that powered the next decade of escalating conflict. Because here's the truth. Whenever someone in power calls equality a problem, it usually means they've realised they're about to lose their exclusive grip on the game. The Edwardians framed suffrage as chaos, when in reality, it was their own monopoly that was unravelling. Or, to sum it up in the way a suffragette might have put it, apparently giving women the vote would lead to cats voting next. To understand why Edwardian Britain was plagued with what it called the suffragette problem, we first need to look backward, straight into the corseted, soot-stained and endlessly rule-obsessed world of the Victorians. The truth is, the Edwardian movement didn't spring fully formed out of nowhere, like Athena leaping out of Zeus's head. It grew out of decades of frustration, activism, and the occasional very awkward tea party in the 19th century. The Victorians laid the groundwork, even if they did so with lace gloves and voices that barely rose above a polite whisper. The 19th century was obsessed with roles, rigid, immovable, and as uncomfortable as a badly laced corset. For middle and upper class women, life revolved around domesticity. They were expected to be models of purity, running households like miniature empires, raising children, and keeping up appearances. Men worked, argued in Parliament, and drank port afterward. Women, by contrast, were supposed to be the angel of the house, a phrase that sounds sweet until you realise it meant being stuck in the house forever, wings clipped and halo polished, while your husband got to make all the rules. The irony was that by mid-Victorian times, women were everywhere in public life, just not in politics. They ran charitable societies, organised church groups, campaigned for education reforms, and fought for better sanitation in the slums. They could lecture, write, and even run businesses, but when it came to the ballot box, they were still treated like decorative wallpaper, useful in setting the mood, but not allowed to hold the hammer and nails. But quietly, and then not so quietly, the demand for suffrage began to grow. The earliest organised suffrage societies date back to the 1860s. In 1866, a petition with over 1,500 signatures was presented to Parliament, demanding women be granted the vote. The Commons politely filed it away, probably in the same drawer where all inconvenient documents went, right next to unpaid bar tabs and letters from furious colonial governors. Still, the petition was a spark. Out of it came the London Society for Women's Suffrage, one of the first groups dedicated to the cause. These early campaigners weren't smashing windows or chaining themselves to gates. They were genteel, polite, and respectable. They preferred pamphlets to protests, petitions to picket lines. Their logic was simple. If they behaved respectably enough, surely men in Parliament would eventually see reason. Spoiler, Parliament did not. But the seeds of organisation, networks, meetings, speeches were planted in these decades, and they would bear fruit later when Edwardians lost patience with politeness. Key figures emerged during this Victorian phase. Militant Farset, for example, started her suffrage career young, inspired by philosopher John Stuart Mill, one of the rare male champions of women's rights. Mill's argument was radical in its simplicity. Women should vote because they were people. Revolutionary stuff, apparently. Fawcett would go on to lead the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, NUWS, the largest suffrage organisation, which later overlapped, sometimes uneasily, with the militant Edwardians. The Victorian suffrage campaigners also found allies among reformers pushing other causes. The late 19th century was a time of noisy debates about education, temperance, labour rights and public health. Women were deeply involved in these movements, partly because they affected daily life so directly. After all, it was women cleaning up cholera outbreaks, stretching family wages to cover rent, and worrying about children coughing their lungs out in polluted slums. The argument naturally followed: if women were responsible for the survival of households, shouldn't they have some say in the laws that govern those households? Yet the Victorian response to this logic was often baffling. Parliament made piecemeal concessions, like allowing women to vote in local elections or serve on school boards. But when it came to national politics, the line was firmly drawn. The country could handle women deciding who managed the drains, but not who managed the empire. The message was clear: thank you for saving thousands from typhoid, but please don't trouble yourself with foreign policy. This period also saw the rise of suffrage societies outside London. In Manchester, Bristol, Edinburgh and beyond, groups of determined women began organising, writing letters and holding meetings. They faced mockery, of course. Critics accused them of being spinsters, hysterics or simply unfeminine. Satirical cartoons often depicted suffragists as frumpy, nagging housewives with broomsticks. The unspoken message: women could either be attractive or political, but never both. Victorian men apparently believed that civic responsibility and good cheekbones could not coexist. And then there was Queen Victoria herself, ironically the longest reigning monarch of the century, who ruled an empire of millions, was no friend to women's suffrage. She dismissed it as mad, wicked folly. In her eyes, women already held moral power at home and needed nothing more. One can imagine the suffragists sighing heavily. "Thank you, Your Majesty, but we'd prefer a vote to a sermon." Still, the Victorian suffrage movement persisted, if slowly. By the 1880s and 1890s, women were writing fiery essays, delivering lectures in town halls, and pressing for reforms with increasing boldness. What they lacked in radical action, they made up for in stamina. Without this steady groundwork, decades of petitions, speeches and quiet organising, the Edwardian suffragettes wouldn't have had the networks, arguments or public awareness to launch their more militant campaign. Looking back, Victorian suffragists resemble a first draft. They tested ideas, built organisations, and endured ridicule, all while wearing floor-length skirts that weighed more than a sack of coal. They were not militants, but they created the scaffolding on which later suffragettes would climb, sometimes literally, onto buildings, waving banners. In the end, the Victorians handed their Edwardian daughters more than a cause. They handed them frustration. Generations of polite asking had achieved little. By 1900, it was clear that Parliament would not be moved by tea parties and careful petitions. Edwardian women inherited not just the dream of suffrage, but the bitter knowledge that reasoned debate hadn't worked. It was time to try something different, something louder, or, as one might put it with a touch of humour, Victorians thought women should be seen, not heard, unless they were playing the piano badly at dinner parties. To understand why women in Edwardian Britain grew restless enough to start smashing windows and chaining themselves to railings, we need to peek into their everyday lives. The Edwardian woman's world was neat, polished, and, let's be honest, claustrophobic. It was a world where social rules weighed more than bricks, where appearances mattered more than practicality, and where your greatest triumph might be a perfectly ironed tablecloth. At first glance, the Edwardian woman's life looked refined, even enviable. Society magazines painted pictures of elegant ladies in wide-brimmed hats, sweeping down boulevards with parasols in hand, or presiding over glittering dinner parties. The reality, of course, was far less glamorous. Beneath those polished surfaces lay an unyielding web of restrictions. Whether rich or poor, women lived under a microscope. Their actions, clothing, and even facial expressions were judged according to rigid codes of behaviour. It wasn't so much a life as a performance, and the audience society was notoriously unforgiving. For middle and upper class women, the daily grind revolved around the household. Running a home wasn't a hobby. It was an empire of its own. The lady of the house was expected to supervise servants, plan meals, arrange flowers, ensure children were raised properly, and generally maintain a level of order that would make a military general weep. Every curtain pleat mattered. Every teaspoon had its place. If anything was out of order, the scandal could ripple through the neighbourhood like wildfire. Imagine neighbours whispering, "Did you see the dust on her mantelpiece?" Civilization must be collapsing. Household management was so important that manuals were published to guide women through it. They included instructions on everything from the correct temperature for boiling laundry to how to fold napkins into swan shapes. A woman might not be trusted to vote, but she was certainly expected to know the proper etiquette for addressing a duke versus a viscount at dinner. One was treated with "Your Grace," the other with "My Lord." Mix them up, and you risked social exile. Meanwhile, fashion added another layer of pressure. Clothing was elaborate, heavy, and time-consuming. Corsets squeezed waists into impossible proportions. Hobble skirts restricted movement to the point that walking looked like a delicate shuffle. And hats grew so massive they could double as bird sanctuaries. Dressing each morning could take hours and required assistance. In short, women were practically immobilized by their own wardrobes. The cruel irony was that society admired women most when they looked effortless, when in fact it had taken half a dozen undergarments, pins, and at least one maid tugging furiously to achieve the look. For working-class women, life was even tougher. They didn't have servants to command. They were the servants. Many worked in other people's houses, scrubbing, polishing, and hauling coal until their hands were raw. Others toiled in factories, shops, or as street vendors, often juggling employment with childcare and household duties of their own. The hours were long, the pay meagre, and the dangers real, from accidents in textile mills to lung damage from inhaling coal dust. And yet, despite shouldering this double burden, working-class women had even less chance of being heard politically. They were expected to labour quietly, pay taxes indirectly through rent and goods, and then fade into the background. Across all classes, education reflected the inequality. Girls from wealthy families might attend finishing schools where they learned French, needlework, and how to pour tea gracefully without spilling. Meanwhile, boys studied Latin, mathematics, and politics, actual preparation for running the country. Girls' education was designed less to cultivate intellect and more to ensure marriageability. The idea was simple. An educated woman was acceptable, but a too educated woman was alarming. She might, heaven forbid, form opinions at dinner. And then there was the etiquette minefield. Edwardian society revolved around rituals of politeness, so complex they could have been an Olympic sport. Women were expected to write thank you notes within 24 hours of receiving any gift, however small. Calling cards had to be left at precisely the right times and in the right manner. Conversations were to be light, witty, and never touch on politics, unless you were flattering a man about his speech in Parliament, in which case it was allowed. A woman's reputation could rise or fall on whether she remembered to curtsy correctly. The pressure was suffocating, and cracks began to show. Many women felt their talents, ambitions, and intelligence were being smothered under endless layers of lace and propriety. They could manage vast households, calculate budgets, and organise charitable works, but they weren't allowed to cast a single vote. They were entrusted with the moral health of the nation, but not with the political health of Parliament. The contradiction was glaring, and women knew it. Even leisure time wasn't truly free. Activities like tennis, cycling, or attending the theatre were tightly monitored by social expectations. Cycling, for example, was scandalous at first. Women on bicycles were accused of being indecent, especially if their skirts flapped too high. Newspapers warned that too much exercise might damage women's delicate constitutions, or worse, their fertility. It seems remarkable that the same society that trusted women to produce the next generation was also convinced they might collapse dramatically after pedalling uphill. Yet, for all the restrictions, Edwardian women began to push boundaries. Some joined clubs and societies where they could debate literature, science, and even politics in relative safety. Others pursued higher education, fought for professional opportunities, or quietly rebelled against expectations in small ways. These cracks in the facade revealed the growing tension of the era. The stage was set. Women were proving daily that they could handle responsibility, intelligence, and independence. What they couldn't handle anymore was being ignored, because at the end of the day, The Edwardian woman's job wasn't just running a household, it was running it so flawlessly that even the dust particles feared her. But as they polished mantelpieces and folded napkins, a thought kept nagging at the back of their minds. Perhaps they were capable of more than just keeping the house spotless. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could keep the nation in order too. If you've ever argued with friends over how best to cook pasta, slow simmer versus rapid boil, you'll have a sense of the split within Britain's suffrage movement. Everyone wanted the same result, but the methods were a matter of heated debate. By the Edwardian era, the women's fight for the vote had divided into two distinct camps: the Suffragists, led by Militant Farset, and the Suffragettes, spearheaded by Emmeline Pankhurst and her formidable daughters. Think of it as the difference between offering Parliament a politely worded letter and offering Parliament a brick through the nearest window. The Suffragists, organised under the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies NUWS, embodied patience, diplomacy and restraint. Militant Farset, their leader, believed in steady persuasion. Her approach was almost scientific: gather facts, present evidence, win allies. She campaigned for decades with a calm conviction that reason would ultimately prevail. Meetings were orderly, speeches rational, and members prided themselves on their decorum. These were women who could bake a tray of scones, attend a parliamentary meeting, and still have time to write a politely devastating letter to the Times. For the suffragists, politics was about persistence, not explosions. They organised petitions with thousands of signatures, lobbied MPs, and published carefully argued pamphlets. Their guiding philosophy was that if women proved themselves as responsible, respectable citizens, the men in Parliament would have no choice but to extend them the vote. The idea was noble, even logical. Unfortunately, it also rested on the assumption that politicians responded to logic. Meanwhile, the suffragettes had a very different motto: deeds, not words. Emmeline Pankhurst and her Women's Social and Political Union embodied a new generation of impatience. After decades of asking nicely and being ignored, they decided it was time to turn up the volume and the violence. These women marched, shouted, smashed, and disrupted. They chained themselves to railings, heckled politicians mid-speech, and made headlines in ways that genteel petitions never could. If the suffragists were the carefully brewed pot of tea, the suffragettes were the boiling kettle shrieking on the stove. It wasn't that the Pankhursts didn't respect the suffragists' work, they just thought it hadn't worked. Parliament had seen thousands of petitions and still shrugged. By contrast, when a suffragette smashed the window of a government office, the entire country talked about it. Deeds, not words, meant that attention was the goal. If politicians wouldn't listen to reason, perhaps they would listen to broken glass, scorched postboxes and chants echoing outside Parliament. The contrast in style was stark. At a suffragist meeting, you might find women calmly debating policy over tea, with charts and notes carefully arranged. At a suffragette rally, you might find women chanting slogans, waving banners and being carried away by police as crowds jeered or cheered. One group believed respectability was their strongest weapon. The other believed respectability was the very chain keeping them down. The media loved this split. Newspapers adored sensationalism, and suffragettes provided it in abundance. A polite essay in a pamphlet didn't sell nearly as many papers as the sight of women being dragged away by policemen while screaming about democracy. Cartoonists depicted suffragists as harmless bluestockings, while suffragettes were drawn as hysterical troublemakers wielding hammers. The irony was that these caricatures, meant to ridicule, only spread their cause further. Behind this public drama, though, the tension between the two groups was real. The suffragists sometimes feared that the militancy of the WSPU made all women look unreasonable, potentially alienating sympathetic men in Parliament. The suffragettes, on the other hand, accused the suffragists of being too timid, too willing to wait while generations of women passed by, voiceless. At suffrage conferences, debates between the factions could get as heated as the ones in Parliament itself, though with more stylish hats in attendance. It's important to note that both approaches had their strengths. The suffragists built networks, cultivated political allies, and created an intellectual foundation for suffrage. They were the backbone of the movement. The suffragettes, by contrast, shook the nation out of apathy. They made the women's vote issue impossible to ignore. One side laid the groundwork, the other set off the fireworks. In a sense, they were two sides of the same coin. just that one side preferred baking that coin into a fruitcake, while the other hurled it through a government window. The divide also reflected class differences. Many suffragists came from middle and upper class backgrounds, emphasising propriety and gradual reform. The Suffragettes, while also drawing many educated women, appealed to a broader swath of frustrated Edwardians who wanted immediate action. Their meetings attracted crowds, their stunts grabbed headlines, and their defiance inspired women who had never before imagined themselves as political actors. By the Edwardian years, this tension was at its height. The NUWS kept knocking politely on Parliament's door, while the WSPU set about kicking it down. Both groups knew that time was running out. The 20th century was dawning with rapid technological and social change. If Britain didn't modernise its politics soon, it risked looking like a relic compared to its continental neighbours. But for all the urgency, the debate over scones or stones defined the suffrage movement, and so Britain watched this strange spectacle unfold. On one side, quiet, tea-sipping campaigners writing carefully worded letters. On the other, fiery activists smashing glass and shouting slogans. Parliament dismissed both with equal disdain, but the public couldn't stop talking about them. Together, though they didn't always admit it, the suffragists and the suffragettes pushed Britain toward the inevitable conclusion that women could no longer be ignored, or, to put it with the blunt humour the situation deserves, one side baked scones, the other threw them through windows. If the suffrage movement was a stage play, then Emmeline Pankhurst was its star actress, director, and occasional pyrotechnics expert all rolled into one. She didn't just enter Edwardian history, she stormed into it, loud enough to make sure no one could ignore her. A widow, a mother, and a tireless agitator, Emmeline didn't believe in waiting politely for change. She believed in forcing it. Born in 1858 in Manchester, she had been politically aware long before votes for women became a slogan. Her upbringing was steeped in reformist ideals. Her parents supported the abolition of slavery and campaigned for social improvement. So political activism was practically the family business. In a sense, Emmeline was destined to be a rabble-rouser. Unlike many women of her generation, she wasn't content to sit quietly in the background while men handled politics. She wanted a front-row seat, and when one wasn't offered, she dragged a chair forward herself. Her marriage to Richard Pankhurst, a barrister and radical thinker, helped shape her path. Richard was a supporter of women's suffrage, which in the 19th century was practically a marriage proposal from the gods. He encouraged her to speak, write, and take part in activism. When he died in 1898, Emmeline was left with 5 children and a fire in her belly that grief only intensified. Widowhood didn't slow her down, it unleashed her. She had nothing left to lose, and that made her dangerous in the best possible way. By 1903, Emmeline had grown weary of the slow, polite methods of existing suffrage groups. She founded the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, in Manchester with her daughters Christabel and Sylvia. Its mission was simple: do whatever it takes to secure votes for women. The motto, "Deeds, not words," wasn't just a catchy slogan, it was a declaration of war on the complacency of Parliament. The Pankhursts were ready to abandon tea-table petitions and move on to direct action. Emmeline herself was a natural leader. She had charisma, the kind that could turn a lecture hall into a battlefield of conviction. She was short, stern, and elegantly dressed, often appearing in public with the poise of a general inspecting her troops. Her speeches could silence a crowd and then ignite it moments later. Audiences described her as magnetic, passionate, and utterly unflinching. She wasn't afraid to confront hecklers or police officers, and she radiated the sort of authority that made even powerful men squirm. She was also strategic. Emmeline understood the power of spectacle. Marches, demonstrations, and headline-grabbing stunts weren't accidents. They were carefully orchestrated to keep suffrage in the news. She knew that polite pamphlets could be ignored, but a suffragette interrupting a political meeting, or better yet, smashing a window during it, was impossible to overlook. In an age before Twitter, breaking glass was the Edwardian version of going viral. Critics accused her of encouraging hysteria, but Emmeline was clear-eyed about her tactics. For decades, suffragists had asked nicely and been dismissed. Parliament had ignored petition after petition. What other choice was left? As she famously declared, "We are here, not because we are lawbreakers, we are here in our efforts to become lawmakers." It was both a battle cry and a clever inversion of the system that condemned her. Her leadership style, however, was not without controversy. Emmeline ran the WSPU with an iron will. She demanded loyalty and discipline, sometimes clashing with her own daughters over strategy. Christabel was her closest ally, favouring militant tactics, while Sylvia leaned toward broader social reform and cooperation with working-class movements. Their disagreements grew so sharp that Sylvia eventually broke away. To outsiders, the Pankhurst family drama looked like a Shakespearean play in corsets, full of ambition, betrayal, and shouting across the dinner table. Still, no one could deny Emmeline's impact. Under her leadership, the WSPU became a force that terrified politicians and fascinated the public. Suffragettes stormed Parliament, disrupted political rallies, and made sure that votes for women was scrawled across newspapers, banners, and even the walls of government buildings. Arrests only seemed to make them stronger, turning Pankhurst and her followers into martyrs of democracy. Of course, the authorities tried to silence her. She was arrested multiple times, thrown into prison, and subjected to harsh conditions. But far from breaking her, prison only sharpened her resolve. Hunger strikes became one of her movement's most potent tools, shocking the public and forcing the government into embarrassing dilemmas. Emmeline wore her arrests like badges of honour, each time she was dragged away by police. Her stature as the leader of the suffrage movement only grew. To her supporters, Emmeline was a hero, a fearless mother of the cause who refused to bow to injustice. To her enemies, she was a menace, a woman who had abandoned feminine virtue in favour of chaos and destruction. But even her critics couldn't deny that she had shifted the ground beneath British politics. Where once the question of women's suffrage could be brushed aside, now it roared from every headline. In the end, Emmeline Pankhurst embodied the transformation of the suffrage movement itself. She was the fire that burned away the old politeness, the storm that forced Parliament to look up from its papers. She wasn't subtle, and she wasn't universally loved, but she was unforgettable. Her idea of diplomacy wasn't endless negotiation, it was breaking windows until Parliament broke down first. Or, to put it another way, Emmeline Pankhurst didn't wait for a seat at the table. She flipped the table over and brought her own chair. If Emmeline Pankhurst was the queen of the suffrage movement, her daughters were the princesses, and like most royal families, they didn't always agree on how to run the kingdom. Christabel and Sylvia Pankhurst were two of the most important figures in the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, but their visions for the fight were so different that they turned the family dining table into a battlefield. The Pankhursts weren't just leading a political campaign, they were also living through a family drama worthy of an Edwardian soap opera. Let's begin with Christabel, Emmeline's eldest daughter and her mother's favourite political partner. Christabel was elegant, fiery, and utterly devoted to the militant cause. She wasn't just a supporter of the WSPU, she was its brain trust, strategist, and sometimes its drill sergeant. Where her mother brought charisma, Christabel supplied calculation. She believed in focused militancy, smashing windows, disrupting meetings, heckling politicians, and making the suffrage movement impossible to ignore. Christabel had a knack for turning ordinary events into national spectacles. At one famous Liberal Party rally, she leapt up and demanded to know why Prime Minister Asquith still refused to grant votes to women. When she was dragged out by police, she bit one of them on the arm. Newspapers couldn't get enough of it. Christabel had mastered what we'd now call media optics. She knew that every dramatic arrest was free publicity. In her view, militancy wasn't chaos, it was strategy. Make politicians uncomfortable enough, she argued, and they'd have to listen. But Christabel also believed in a narrow focus. For her, the vote was everything. Other social reforms, poverty, labour rights, colonial injustices could wait. Suffrage was the key, the master domino that would topple all others. She wasn't interested in diluting the movement's power with side causes. This single-minded focus sometimes made her sound ruthless, but it also made her effective. Her energy was directed like a laser beam at Parliament's stubborn resistance. On the other side of the table sat Sylvia Pankhurst, Christabel's younger sister, who had the same fire but aimed it differently. Sylvia was an artist by training, a painter who had studied at the Royal College of Art, and she brought that creative vision into her activism. She designed banners, posters and illustrations for the movement, making suffrage not just a political demand but a visual spectacle. Where Christabel wielded strategy like a sword, Sylvia wielded art like a banner. But Sylvia's differences went far deeper than aesthetics. She was passionate about social reform beyond the vote. She believed suffrage was important, yes, but she also cared deeply about the working class, trade unions, and broader questions of equality. For Sylvia, fighting for votes for women wasn't enough if the poorest and most vulnerable remained voiceless. She wanted the suffrage movement to align with socialist causes, to include working-class women, and to tackle issues like housing, wages and education alongside the ballot. This broader vision put her at odds with Christabel's narrow militancy. While Christabel wanted suffrage first, Sylvia argued that suffrage couldn't be separated from wider social justice. To her, a movement that only represented middle and upper-class women was incomplete. She wanted a movement for all women, not just those who could afford wide-brimmed hats. The clash between Christabel and Sylvia wasn't just theoretical, it was explosive. Christabel saw her sister's socialist sympathies as a distraction, diluting the message of votes for women. Sylvia saw Christabel's militancy as elitist, alienating working-class allies. Their disagreements became so intense that Sylvia eventually broke away from the WSPU altogether, founding her own organisation in London's East End. There, she worked directly with working-class communities, organising rallies and support networks, fusing the fight for suffrage with the struggle against poverty. The Pankhurst household must have been an exhausting place to eat dinner. Imagine Emmeline at the head of the table trying to keep control, while Christabel insisted on more window smashing, and Sylvia argued for more alliances with trade unions. And then there was Adela, another Pankhurst daughter, who also broke away in frustration and emigrated to Australia, possibly because family dinners were becoming more dangerous than police batons. The media, of course, loved this drama. Newspapers reported on the splits as gleefully as they covered the protests themselves. To the public, it seemed like the Pankhursts were running two movements at once, one militant and upper class, the other socialist and grassroots. Both were loud, passionate and uncompromising, just in very different keys. Despite their conflicts, Christabel and Sylvia each left a profound legacy. Christabel showed how militant action could dominate the headlines and force suffrage into the national conversation. Sylvia demonstrated how the fight for the vote connected to deeper struggles for justice, laying groundwork that would resonate long after suffrage was achieved. Together, their differences actually broadened the movement's reach, even if they never fully reconciled. And what of Emmeline in all this? She sided firmly with Christabel, preferring the militant line and the centralised control of the WSPU. This decision strained her relationship with Sylvia, sometimes to the breaking point. Mother and daughter found themselves on opposite sides of protests, with Sylvia's supporters jeering Emmeline's followers. It was less a family united, and more a family civil war played out in public. Still, the fact that two sisters could take the same cause and shape it so differently is part of what made the suffrage movement so dynamic. It wasn't a single monolithic campaign, it was a living, breathing struggle full of competing ideas, personalities and strategies. And in the Pankhurst family, that tension was personified in the clash between Christabel's laser-focused militancy and Sylvia's sweeping social vision. Or, as one wag might put it, Christabel wanted votes, Sylvia wanted social reform. Their family dinners must have been awkward. If you were an Edwardian politician in the early 1900s, you might have sighed when yet another petition about women's suffrage landed on your desk. You would nod politely, thank the ladies for their trouble, and then quietly file it under ignore. For decades, this tactic worked. Polite words were easy to dismiss, but the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, decided to flip the script. They adopted a motto that would haunt the Edwardian establishment: deeds, not words. This wasn't just a slogan, it was a declaration of war on apathy. The suffrage campaign had already been drenched in words, speeches, essays, pamphlets, polite appeals, and carefully worded letters, but words alone hadn't moved Parliament an inch closer to reform. The WSPU realised that if the system ignored voices, perhaps it would pay attention to actions. It was a simple but radical idea: stop talking, start doing, or, to put it another way, when words don't work, try superglue. The motto signalled a shift from the theoretical to the practical. No longer would women simply ask for suffrage, they would demand it through direct action. The genius of deeds, not words, was that it was both flexible and confrontational. It gave the WSPU freedom to experiment, to escalate, and to shock, and shock they did. Suddenly, Edwardians found women chaining themselves to railings outside government buildings, interrupting political meetings, and hammering on the doors of Parliament. It was politics turned into theatre, with suffragettes as the leading ladies of disruption. One of the earliest and most famous tactics was chaining themselves to fences and railings. The symbolism was delicious, women physically attaching themselves to the very institutions that excluded them. It forced police officers into the awkward task of sawing women off metal gates while crowds gathered to watch. It was absurd, inconvenient, and unforgettable. The perfect embodiment of deeds. The image of a well-dressed Edwardian lady refusing to budge, padlocked to Parliament, was far more powerful than any pamphlet. Other deeds included public heckling of politicians. Suffragettes would burst into campaign events, stand up in the audience, and demand answers. Why won't you give votes to women? The effect was electrifying. Politicians, unused to being challenged by women, fumbled, grew red-faced, and often called for security. The hecklers were dragged out, sometimes beaten, and almost always arrested, but that was part of the plan. Every arrest made headlines. Every struggle in a crowded hall reinforced the message. Women were no longer passive observers. They were participants, whether men liked it or not. Then came deliberate acts of vandalism. Shop windows were smashed, golf courses were vandalised, and postboxes set alight with chemical devices. These weren't random acts of destruction. They were chosen for maximum visibility and irritation. The WSPU argued that property could be sacrificed for progress, since property mattered more to Parliament than women's voices. Critics howled that such deeds were outrageous, hysterical, and even unladylike, which of course was exactly the point. By being unladylike, the suffragettes exposed the absurdity of the expectations placed upon them. The motto also inspired creative stunts. Suffragettes climbed onto rooftops, unfurled banners, and even sneaked into the House of Commons disguised as cleaning staff. One memorable incident saw activists chaining themselves to statues in the lobby, forcing police to chip them free like reluctant marble adornments. Each stunt was designed to generate maximum embarrassment for the government and maximum publicity for the cause. For Edwardian society, the shock was immense. These were women who were supposed to embody gentleness, patience, and quiet dignity. Instead, they were loud, disruptive, and fearless. Newspapers splashed lurid headlines across their pages, calling suffragettes a menace to public order. But paradoxically, the more the press mocked them, the more coverage they received. The motto, "Deeds not words," turned into a self-perpetuating machine. Every deed became a story. Every story spread the cause further. It also revealed the double standard of Edwardian politics. When men protested violently, workers striking, nationalists rioting, it was treated as serious if regrettable politics. When women did the same, it was labelled hysteria. Deeds, not words, forced Britain to confront its prejudices. By acting decisively, suffragettes exposed the hypocrisy of a system that applauded male defiance but condemned female defiance as madness. Of course, not everyone approved. Even within the broader suffrage movement, some saw the motto as reckless. The more moderate suffragists worried that violent deeds undermined their long years of careful persuasion. But the WSPU's motto wasn't aimed at winning friends in Parliament. It was about making suffrage impossible to ignore, and in that it succeeded. By 1909, no one in Britain could claim they hadn't heard of the suffragettes. The motto also carried a moral sting. When suffragettes went to prison and staged hunger strikes, their suffering became a deed in itself, a silent but powerful indictment of the government's refusal to grant basic rights. Each woman who endured force-feeding embodied the motto in flesh and blood. Words could be dismissed as rhetoric. Deeds like these could not. Looking back, "Deeds, not words" was more than a rallying cry. It was a revolution in strategy. It transformed suffrage from a polite request into a national crisis. It was bold, disruptive, and infuriating, but it worked. The Edwardian establishment could ignore petitions, but it could not ignore smashed glass, chained women, and packed courtrooms. Or, to put it with the kind of sharp humour the suffragettes might have enjoyed, when words don't work, try superglue. The Edwardian upgrade. If the motto, "Deeds, not words," was the engine of the suffragette campaign, then spectacle was its fuel. The Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, didn't just march, They staged performances. They didn't just carry banners, they carried banners designed like visual manifestos. In an era when Edwardian society adored pageantry, royal coronations, military parades, and even flower shows, the suffragettes cleverly turned politics into theatre. If you weren't listening to them, you were at least watching them. The suffragettes understood something their opponents didn't. Optics matter. You could write a 20-page pamphlet and it might get tossed into a drawer, but put 500 women in coordinated colours marching through London, and suddenly the city stopped to stare. They wanted the public to feel politics, not just read about it. In an age before television or social media, the suffragettes made themselves into walking billboards for democracy. One of their greatest innovations was the use of colour symbolism. The WSPU adopted purple, white and green as their official colours. Purple symbolised dignity, white represented purity, and green stood for hope. Together, the trio was striking, unmistakable, and endlessly adaptable. Women wore sashes across their dresses in these colours, waved flags dyed in the same hues, and festooned entire processions with them. Even jewellery was designed in suffrage colours, turning brooches and necklaces into subtle acts of defiance. The brilliance of this choice was psychological as well as visual. Edwardians loved order and coordination, and seeing hundreds of women dressed in these colours gave the impression of unity, strength and discipline. It looked less like a fringe movement and more like a political army on parade. Opponents might sneer, but they couldn't deny the visual power. Marches were the suffragette stage productions, carefully choreographed and widely advertised. They drew massive crowds. The 1908 Hyde Park Rally, for example, was one of the largest demonstrations Britain had ever seen, with estimates ranging up to 500,000 participants and spectators. Imagine it, vast avenues filled with banners, women marching in neat rows, the colours purple, white and green rippling in the wind. This wasn't protest, it was spectacle on the scale of a royal procession. The marches served multiple purposes. They inspired participants, who felt the solidarity of walking shoulder to shoulder with thousands of others. They attracted press attention, providing ready-made photographs for the newspapers, and they unsettled opponents, who suddenly saw that this was no small group of eccentric ladies, but a mass movement capable of mobilising the streets. The suffragettes also elevated protest art. Sylvia Pankhurst, with her artistic training, designed bold banners and posters. Bong! These weren't dull slogans scrawled on cardboard. They were works of art in themselves, featuring striking images, bold typography, and symbolism that hammered home the message. In processions, banners were carried high like medieval standards, transforming the streets into political theatres. Each banner often celebrated historical heroines, figures like Joan of Arc, Elizabeth I, or Boudica, reminding Britain that women had always been warriors, rulers and leaders. It was a clever tactic, anchoring the fight for suffrage in a proud national tradition, making it harder for critics to dismiss. Who could argue that women were unfit for politics when their banners featured queens who had run the kingdom better than many kings? But the spectacle didn't end with pageantry. It extended into disruption. The suffragettes staged theatrical interruptions at political events. They would rise in the middle of a speech, unfurl a banner, and shout slogans, creating drama that rivaled any stage play. Edwardian crowds who adored the theatre suddenly found their politics turned into one. It was scandalous, yes, but also riveting. Even their arrests became part of the show. Suffragettes didn't go quietly. They shouted, resisted, and turned their removal into a performance. Crowds gathered to watch, newspapers photographed it, and the image of women being dragged away by police became a recurring Edwardian tableau. What looked like chaos was in fact carefully staged theatre. The WSPU even treated protest like branding. They sold badges, ribbons, postcards, and even china decorated in suffrage colours. Attending a rally was like stepping into a well-stocked gift shop of resistance. This wasn't accidental. Selling merchandise both raised funds and spread the colours and slogans into everyday life. A suffrage postcard pinned above a mantelpiece was a daily reminder of the cause. For Edwardian society, which adored order and propriety, the sight of women turning politics into spectacle was shocking. Politics was supposed to be dull, long speeches in stuffy chambers, not banners flying like battle standards. The suffragettes upended that expectation. They made suffrage impossible to ignore, not by sneaking into politics quietly, but by marching into it like a parade. The The genius of the spectacle was that it was contagious. Once you had seen a march of women in purple, white and green chanting slogans, you couldn't unsee it. The image lodged in the public imagination. Even those who mocked the suffragettes helped spread their message by describing their theatrics in detail. And perhaps that was the point. For all the fury about smashed windows or interrupted speeches, the spectacle of suffrage was unforgettable. Politics wasn't just for Parliament anymore. It was for the streets, the newspapers, and the imagination of the people. Or, to put it more bluntly, why send a quiet petition when you can send 500 women in purple and green yelling outside Parliament? When you hear the phrase civil disobedience, you might imagine Gandhi calmly marching to the sea, or students holding placards in silence. Edwardian civil disobedience, however, came with a louder soundtrack, the crash of glass, the clang of chains, and the occasional startled yelp of a policeman walloped with a handbag. The suffragettes didn't invent protest, but they gave it a distinctly Edwardian twist. Polite society collided head-on with deliberate mischief, and the result was unforgettable. The window-smashing campaign was one of the most notorious tactics. To modern ears, it sounds almost petty. Why break windows? But in Edwardian Britain, windows were symbols of wealth and authority. Shops in London's West End displayed glittering goods behind plate glass, tempting customers but also flaunting exclusivity. Government offices, banks and elegant clubs hid behind shining panes of glass, literal barriers between the establishment and the public. By smashing them, suffragettes weren't just vandalising property, they were smashing symbols of privilege. In 1912, a coordinated campaign sent shockwaves through London. Suffragettes, armed with hammers, stones, and sometimes even concealed axes, strode through shopping districts and government areas, shattering window after window. It was a spectacle of destruction that left the city looking as though it had been caught in a hailstorm. Police scrambled to arrest culprits, but the sheer number of women involved made it nearly impossible to contain. For Edwardian Londoners who adored order and tidiness, the sight of broken glass littering fashionable streets was scandalous and impossible to ignore. Then there were the postbox attacks. These were clever, disruptive, and symbolic. Suffragettes slipped small chemical devices or ink into public postboxes, destroying letters and staining correspondence. It was a pointed attack on communication itself, a way of saying, if the government refuses to listen to women, we'll make sure nobody's letters get through. It may have been annoying to the average Edwardian waiting for a delivery from Aunt Mildred, but that irritation was part of the strategy. Suffragette deeds were meant to ripple through daily life, forcing ordinary people to confront the question of women's rights, even if they'd never attended a rally. Beyond glass and post, there was arson. Empty buildings, such as unoccupied houses, sports pavilions and even churches were sometimes targeted for firebombing. The suffragettes were careful to avoid harming people, but the property damage was severe. Cricket grounds and golf courses proved especially tempting targets. There's something almost mischievous in the image. Edwardian gentlemen showing up for a round of golf, only to find the clubhouse charred with a suffrage slogan painted on the wall. For the suffragettes, it was poetic justice. If they weren't allowed to play in the political game, why should men enjoy their leisurely ones uninterrupted? Civil disobedience also included theatrical confrontations. Suffragettes stormed into government buildings, chained themselves to benches, and disrupted parliamentary sessions. One famous incident involved a suffragette smuggling herself into the Prime Minister's residence, disguised as a delivery person. Others climbed onto statues, draped them in suffrage banners, and refused to come down until arrested. These weren't random stunts, they were deliberate attempts to create scenes that the press couldn't resist reporting. And yes, sometimes handbags were weaponized. Police officers tasked with dispersing protests found themselves scratched, kicked, and occasionally clouted by indignant Edwardian ladies. The visual alone was irresistible to cartoonists. A uniformed constable fending off blows from a handbag while trying to maintain dignity. Nothing says equality quite like giving a policeman a mild concussion with your handbag. The point of these actions wasn't to inflict lasting damage, but to force visibility. For years, suffrage had been treated as an optional sidebar to real politics. By escalating civil disobedience, suffragettes made it impossible for the issue to be ignored. Broken windows and burned-out pavilions couldn't be shoved into a filing cabinet. They had to be addressed, and they filled newspapers with stories that thrust women's voices into the national conversation. Of course, reactions were mixed. Many Edwardians were horrified, calling suffragettes vandals and lunatics. Others admired their daring. The authorities certainly despised the disruption. Prime Minister H. Asquith, a staunch opponent of suffrage, found himself personally targeted by suffragette protests on multiple occasions. He couldn't step outside without risking heckling, ambushes or banners unfurling in his path. Critics argued that militancy damaged the movement by alienating potential supporters, but suffragettes countered that polite tactics had been tried for decades with no success. If property damage and inconvenience were what it took to rattle the establishment, then so be it. Civil disobedience was meant to sting. It also carried risk. Arrests were frequent, and prison sentences harsh, but suffragettes wore imprisonment as a badge of honour. To them, every window smashed, every postbox ruined, and every night in jail was part of a greater campaign to prove their resolve. Civil disobedience was not random chaos. It was carefully calculated performance designed to show that women would no longer accept silence. In Edwardian Britain, a society obsessed with order, manners and control, suffragettes weaponized disorder. They broke the rules to expose the unfairness of the rules themselves. Each shattered pane of glass was a reminder that democracy, as it stood, was already broken. Or, to put it more bluntly, nothing says equality like giving a policeman a mild concussion with your handbag. When the suffragettes declared deeds, not words, they knew they were heading for prison. What they didn't anticipate was how prison would become its own battlefield. The government, determined not to look weak, cracked down hard on arrested suffragettes. But soon they faced a problem. Suffragettes were refusing food, staging hunger strikes as a form of protest. The result was a political nightmare. Women collapsing in cells, newspapers reporting on their suffering, and public sympathy tilting toward the supposed hysterics. At first, the government responded with force-feeding, a grisly ordeal that will save for its own chapter. But the backlash was ferocious. Doctors objected, activists protested, and headlines blared about the brutality of the state. The sight of frail women being strapped down and force-fed through tubes didn't make Britain look like the proud cradle of democracy. It made it look like a bully. Something had to change. Enter the Prisoners' Temporary Discharge for Ill Health in 1913, better known by its sinister nickname, the Cat and Mouse Act. The law was as sneaky as its name suggests. Under it, suffragettes who went on hunger strike would be released from prison once their health reached a dangerous low. The government could pat itself on the back for not letting anyone die behind bars. Good optics there. But here was the catch. Once the women had recovered, the police were free to swoop in and rearrest them to finish the rest of their sentence. Release, recover, rearrest. Over and over. It was less justice, more hide-and-seek with prison doors. To the Home Office, this was a clever compromise. No more messy force-feeding scandals, no martyrs dying in prison cells. The state could look merciful while still keeping its iron grip. But to suffragettes, it was torment. Imagine the cycle. Starve yourself in prison, get released weak and half-broken, nurse yourself back to health with the help of friends, then just when you could stand up straight again, hear a knock at the door and see police waiting to drag you back. It was psychological warfare disguised as law. The act quickly became infamous. Newspapers seized on the image of women as hunted prey, chased down repeatedly by the state. Supporters of suffrage condemned it as cowardly cruelty. Even some critics of the movement admitted the law looked absurd. The nickname Cat and Mouse said it all. The government was playing with suffragettes like predators, toying with their prey, letting them escape just enough to keep the game going. The suffragettes, of course, didn't take it lying down. They turned the act into propaganda gold. Posters depicted the government as a monstrous cat pawing at helpless mice. Speeches denounced it as tyranny. Women rearrested under the act became living symbols of state oppression. The very cruelty designed to weaken the movement only strengthened its moral force. There were also acts of defiance. Some women, once released, went into hiding, sheltered by sympathisers in safe houses. Police were left prowling the streets, humiliated when they failed to recapture their mice. Others deliberately returned to protest activities the moment they were free, daring the state to chase them again. What had been intended as a deterrent became almost a badge of honour. To be a mouse was to prove your courage. The mechanics of the act exposed just how desperate the government had become. For all its bluster about law and order, it revealed that the state was terrified of suffragette deaths in custody. A martyr would have been a disaster, igniting sympathy and outrage across the nation. By crafting this legal game, the authorities admitted, in effect, that the suffragettes had the upper hand in moral theatre. The Cat and Mouse Act was less a show of strength than an awkward dance of fear. And make no mistake, the public noticed. Ordinary Edwardians, who might not have cared much about suffrage before, found themselves asking uncomfortable questions. Why was the government afraid of women starving in prison? Why chase them in and out of jail like criminals when all they wanted was a vote? If women were truly irrational or powerless, as critics claimed, why was the state bending over backward to control them? The Act also underscored the suffragettes' resilience. They weren't just willing to risk arrest, they were willing to risk their health, their bodies, even their lives. The Cat and Mouse Act was supposed to break their spirits. Instead, it highlighted their endurance. Each time a suffragette was released, she emerged as a survivor. Each time she was rearrested, her defiance only deepened. The cycle became a grim but powerful reminder of the stakes of the struggle. In the end, the Cat and Mouse Act achieved the opposite of what its architects intended. Instead of sidelining the suffragettes, it made them symbols of persistence against cruelty. The government looked like a clumsy predator, the suffragettes like indomitable prey who refused to give in. The imagery was so damning that even those unmoved by arguments for equality could see the injustice. Or, to sum it up with the bite of humour the suffragettes themselves might have appreciated, it was less justice, more hide-and-seek with prison doors. If Edwardian Britain had hoped prison would silence suffragettes, they miscalculated badly. Behind bars, these women discovered a weapon that required no stones, no chains, and no banners, their own bodies. Hunger strikes turned imprisonment into a new battlefield, transforming frail prisoners into symbols of iron resolve. And when the government responded with force-feeding, it created a scandal so grotesque that it shocked the nation. The logic of the hunger strike was simple but devastatingly effective. Once arrested, suffragettes refused to eat. It was an act of defiance that put the state in an impossible position. If officials allowed them to starve, they risked creating martyrs, women who literally gave their lives for the vote. If they intervened, they had to admit that political prisoners were willing to suffer in ways ordinary criminals never would. Either way, the government looked weak or cruel. The hunger strikes began around 1909 and quickly spread through suffragette ranks. It was a strategy born of desperation. In prison, suffragettes were often denied recognition as political prisoners and treated like common criminals. They wanted to demonstrate that their struggle was not petty law-breaking, but a fight for justice. Refusing food was their way of saying, "We will not play by your rules, even inside your walls." The results were dramatic. Women grew frail, fainted in their cells, and sometimes collapsed in court appearances, forcing magistrates to watch the consequences of their own sentences. Newspapers reported on the shocking condition of released prisoners, their once vibrant figures reduced to shadows of themselves. Public sympathy began to tilt. People who might not have supported smashed windows found it hard to condone starving women being treated with indifference. The government's answer was grim: force-feeding. Doctors and warders were ordered to keep prisoners alive by any means necessary. The process was brutal. A suffragette would be restrained, sometimes held down by multiple guards, while a rubber tube was forced up her nose or down her throat. Liquid food was poured in, often leaving her choking, gagging, and sometimes vomiting. Teeth were broken in the struggle, throats were injured, and infections were common. Accounts from women who endured it are harrowing. Some describe the feeling of suffocation, the pain of the tube scraping against the back of the throat, and the humiliation of being physically overpowered. Others spoke of the psychological torment waiting for the next session, knowing the ordeal would be repeated day after day. It wasn't nourishment, it was punishment disguised as medical care. Critics of the government seized on the horror. Newspapers compared force-feeding to torture. Religious leaders condemned it as inhumane. Even some doctors protested, arguing that the practice violated medical ethics. What was supposed to be a tidy solution to the hunger strike crisis turned into a public relations disaster. The image of respectable women being force-fed in prison cells made the government look like a tyrant. The suffragettes, for their part, turned the ordeal into fuel for the movement. Those who survived force-feeding emerged from prison as living symbols of resilience. They bore the physical scars, but also the moral authority of having endured cruelty for the cause. Crowds greeted their release with cheers, and their stories became rallying cries at rallies and in suffrage newspapers. It's worth noting that the government justified force-feeding as protecting life. Officials insisted they couldn't allow women to die in custody, but this paternalistic excuse rang hollow. Suffragettes pointed out the hypocrisy. The same politicians who denied women's humanity in politics suddenly claimed to care about their health in prison. To them, it was less about saving lives and more about saving face. The public debate grew so heated that the issue reached Parliament itself. MPs were forced to answer uncomfortable questions. Was it right to strap down women and shove tubes into their bodies, simply for demanding a vote? Some defended it as necessary, others admitted it was barbaric. But even as arguments raged, the practice continued, fueling outrage with every new account that leaked into the press. The hunger strikes and force-feeding became a cycle of endurance. Women went into prison, refused food, were force-fed, and emerged weakened but defiant. Each cycle added more pressure to the government, which found itself caught between cruelty and concession. The Cat and Mouse Act passed later was an attempt to escape this trap, but during the years of force-feeding, the damage was already done. For Edwardian society, the spectacle was deeply unsettling. Women had long been cast as fragile, delicate, and in need of protection, yet here they were, deliberately starving themselves and enduring violent treatment with unflinching resolve. It inverted every stereotype. The suffragettes showed that fragility was a myth and that determination could be more powerful than brute force. In the end, the hunger strikes and the government's response changed the narrative of the movement. Suffragettes were no longer just activists. They were martyrs in waiting, willing to risk everything. The state, in contrast, looked clumsy, cruel, and desperate. Each broken tooth, each bruised throat, each fainting body told the world that the struggle for votes was about more than politics. It was about human dignity. Or, to put it in the stark humour that suffragettes themselves might have used to cut through the horror, breakfast didn't energise you, it was shoved down your throat by force. If the suffragettes were performers, the Edwardian press was their stage manager, grudging, sensationalist, and sometimes scandalously entertained. Newspapers in early 20th century Britain thrived on drama, and the suffragettes delivered it in spades. Window smashing, arrests, hunger strikes, perfect front-page fodder. The result was a love-hate relationship. The media mocked and vilified the women's movement, while simultaneously giving it more coverage than any polite petition could ever dream of. The tone of reporting was often dripping with ridicule. Journalists described suffragettes as hysterical spinsters, violent harridans, or misguided daughters who should really just go home and embroider something. Headlines read like caricature, "Women run amok," or "Ladies behave like lunatics in Parliament Square." The message was clear: women demanding the vote weren't to be taken seriously, they were to be laughed at. And yet, every time a newspaper mocked the suffragettes, it kept them in the public eye. Cartoonists in particular had a field day. Satirical illustrations portrayed suffragettes as masculine, ugly, or absurdly violent. One popular theme showed men saddled with babies and cooking pots while women in trousers strode off to Parliament, the implication being that suffrage would reverse the natural order. Another showed cats with banners, because of course cats were dragged into the debate, hinting that once women voted, household pets would demand ballots next. To the Edwardian imagination, women with political power seemed as ludicrous as animals casting votes. But here's the twist. While the mockery stung, it also amplified the message. Even readers who disagreed with the suffragettes couldn't escape the constant headlines. Their deeds became common conversation, debated in pubs, tea shops and drawing rooms. The government may have wanted to silence them, but the press made that impossible. By sensationalising every protest, the media accidentally ensured the cause remained part of daily life. Not all coverage was hostile, though. Some papers, particularly those sympathetic to liberal or radical causes, expressed grudging admiration. They noted the courage of women facing arrest, the injustice of force-feeding, and the determination behind hunger strikes. These sympathetic reports gave legitimacy to the movement, showing that not everyone saw the suffragettes as laughable extremists. But even when the press tried to support them, it often did so in a tone of astonishment, as though women showing bravery was something out of a fairy tale. And then there were the big set-piece events, perfect media spectacles, large marches, banner unfurling stunts, and confrontations with police guaranteed column inches. Editors knew these stories sold papers. Readers devoured them not only for political debate, but also for the sheer entertainment value. After all, in an era without television or radio news, the sight of women battling policemen in Trafalgar Square was as thrilling as a serialised adventure novel. The Suffragettes were not naive about this. They understood the power of publicity and leaned into it. WEDISPU organisers often timed protests to coincide with major political events, ensuring journalists would already be present. They staged disruptions designed to be photographed, women chaining themselves to railings, climbing statues or waving banners in the middle of a crowd. If newspapers were going to portray them as a circus, they would at least control the script. The movement also produced its own media. The WSPU published a weekly newspaper, Votes for Women, filled with speeches, reports and images that told their story without the filter of hostile editors. Other suffrage groups had similar publications. These papers allowed women to present themselves as articulate, thoughtful and brave, countering the sensational caricatures in mainstream outlets. And they worked. Circulation numbers rose, and the suffragette press became a lifeline for supporters who wanted to see their cause taken seriously. Of course, the relationship between suffragettes and the mainstream press was not without irony. Editors who condemned suffragette militancy privately loved the circulation boost it brought. A smashed window might horrify a shopkeeper, but it delighted a journalist who needed a headline before the print deadline. There's even evidence that some newspapers exaggerated events for dramatic effect, reporting chaos where there had only been a scuffle. In other words, suffragettes gave the press material, and the press gave suffragettes notoriety. Both sides benefited, even as they pretended to despise each other. The Edwardian public, caught in the middle, developed polarised views. For some, the constant headlines confirmed that suffragettes were dangerous radicals threatening the fabric of society. For others, the sheer volume of stories demonstrated how determined these women were. After all, if they were just silly troublemakers, why did they dominate the news cycle week after week? The media circus forced everyone to have an opinion. It also created iconic imagery. Photographs of suffragettes being hauled off by police, banners waving defiantly above jeering crowds, or women standing battered but unbowed outside courtrooms became part of Britain's collective memory. These were not just news items, they were visual symbols of a struggle unfolding in real time. In hindsight, the press's attempts to ridicule the suffragettes often backfired. The more outrageous the headlines, the more heroic the women appeared by contrast. A story claiming civilization collapses because a woman threw a rock at a window only underscored the absurdity of denying half the population a voice in politics. The suffragettes understood this irony and sometimes leaned into it, wryly noting that their opponents seemed to think democracy was as fragile as a teacup. Or, to put it in the biting humour the suffragettes themselves might have enjoyed, headlines were basically, "Woman throws rock at window, civilization collapses." For most Edwardians, a courtroom was a place of solemnity. Barristers in wigs droned on, magistrates dozed discreetly, and the public shuffled in for the occasional scandalous divorce case. But when suffragettes entered the dock, the courtroom transformed from a chamber of law into a theatre of politics. The government wanted trials to show women being punished for breaking the law. The suffragettes had other plans. They treated their trials as platforms, loud, dramatic and impossible to ignore. When arrested for protests, whether smashing windows, chaining themselves to railings, or interrupting political meetings, suffragettes often refused to play the role of meek defendants. Instead, they seized the stage. Once inside the dock, they launched into speeches about democracy, justice, and the hypocrisy of a state that taxed women while silencing them at the ballot box. The dock became a podium, the courtroom audience a captive crowd, and the magistrates unwilling props in a performance no one could stop. This tactic baffled and infuriated judges. Edwardian courtrooms thrived on order, with everyone knowing their role. Barristers argued, witnesses testified, and defendants mostly kept quiet. Suffragettes gleefully tore up this script. They interrupted proceedings, cross-examined prosecutors, and treated sentencing as an opportunity to thunder about injustice. Onlookers described some trials as more exciting than a night at the music hall. After all, how often did you see a woman in a feathered hat berating a High Court judge? The tone of these speeches was unapologetic. A suffragette rarely expressed remorse. Instead, she declared her actions necessary, part of a righteous struggle. "We are not criminals," many insisted. "We are freedom fighters." They compared themselves to revolutionaries, martyrs, and patriots. In a society obsessed with respectability, this brazen defiance was shocking, but it was also magnetic. Newspapers reported on the fiery exchanges, and suddenly what should have been routine sentencing turned into national debates about justice. Some suffragettes even used humour in court. They mocked the absurdity of being tried for demanding rights, highlighting the contradictions in the law. One activist quipped that if breaking a window warranted months in prison, perhaps politicians deserved life sentences for breaking promises. Laughter rippled through the gallery, much to the judge's horror. It was courtroom disruption as political satire. Lawyers defending suffragettes sometimes struggled to keep up. Many defendants refused traditional legal representation altogether, preferring to speak for themselves. Why waste time on legal niceties when you could deliver a rousing speech? The courtroom became less about verdicts and more about visibility. Every sentence handed down was turned into propaganda, proof that the state was terrified of women's voices. One of the most famous examples came after the 1912 window smashing campaign. Dozens of suffragettes were put on trial simultaneously, their cases flooding London's courts. The proceedings were chaotic, with defendants shouting over judges and refusing to recognise the court's authority. Instead of apologising, they doubled down, proclaiming that justice itself was on trial. The spectacle filled newspapers for weeks, keeping suffrage at the centre of public conversation. For the authorities, these trials were a nightmare. They wanted swift convictions and quiet punishments. Instead, they got headline-grabbing speeches and public sympathy for women who looked more like political martyrs than common criminals. Judges often grew visibly flustered, banging gavels, threatening harsher sentences, and complaining about disrespect. Yet the harsher the sentence, the stronger the suffragettes' case appeared. If the state had to lock up women for speaking their minds, surely that proved how unjust the system was. The trials also revealed the class prejudices underpinning Edwardian justice. Well-off suffragettes could sometimes pay fines or secure lighter sentences. Working-class women faced harsher conditions and fewer options. Yet in court, they all stood side by side, blurring class lines in a way that unsettled the establishment. The suffragette dock wasn't just a legal space, it was a stage for solidarity. Newspapers, ever hungry for drama, covered these courtroom clashes with relish. Sketches showed suffragettes pointing fingers at judges, waving arms in defiance, or refusing to sit down. Headlines declared trials uproarious and unprecedented. Critics sneered at the hysteria, but readers devoured every word. The government found itself caught in a paradox. The more it prosecuted suffragettes, the more publicity the movement received. For the women themselves, trials were more than performances. They were opportunities to assert dignity in a system designed to deny it. To stand in the dock and demand recognition was itself an act of rebellion. It showed that women could not be silenced, even under threat of prison. In an age when women were supposed to speak softly, here they were shouting down magistrates. In hindsight, the courtroom battles were as important as the street protests. They demonstrated the suffragettes' ability to turn every situation to their advantage. Even punishment became propaganda. Even sentencing became spectacle. The authorities had hoped to humiliate them. Instead, the women turned the tables, humiliating the state by exposing its fear. And if a suffragette ever needed to sum up her courtroom strategy, it might sound something like this. They treated the dock like it was open mic night, except the jokes were about justice. The story of the suffrage movement is often told as women versus men, brave heroines fighting against a wall of stubborn male politicians, and for the most part that was true. Edwardian politics was dominated by men who clung to power as if the ballot box were their personal cigar case. But not all men were villains in this tale. Some stood up, spoke out, and risked ridicule by supporting the suffragettes. In doing so, they proved that allies could come in unlikely forms, even if siding with women's rights in Edwardian Britain was about as popular in the pub as ordering a salad. One of the most prominent allies was Keir Hardie, the Scottish trade unionist and founder of the Labour Party. Hardie was outspoken, fiery, and unafraid of scandal. He not only supported women's suffrage but publicly championed it, clashing with Parliament and even Prime Minister Asquith. He formed a close relationship with Sylvia Pankhurst, who shared his commitment to linking suffrage with broader social reform. To Hardie, the struggle for the vote was inseparable from the fight for workers' rights. His stance made him a thorn in the side of the establishment. and a rare male voice who dared to echo suffragette demands inside the Commons. Another crucial figure was Henry Davison, a journalist and war correspondent. Davison wasn't content just to write about the movement. He marched alongside suffragettes, spoke at rallies, and helped found the Men's League for Women's Suffrage in 1907. The League was a group of men who believed denying women the vote was not only unjust but also absurd. They weren't afraid to stand shoulder to shoulder with female activists, even as critics mocked them as unmanly. In Edwardian Britain, where masculinity was measured by moustaches and cricket scores, supporting suffragettes was practically heresy. The Men's League itself deserves mention. Though never large in number, its members were passionate, articulate, and often well-connected. They used their social standing to pressure politicians and provided a bridge between militant suffragettes and more moderate suffragists. Some even put themselves in physical danger, protecting women during demonstrations or enduring jeers and assaults from hostile crowds. While it was women who bore the brunt of arrests and force-feeding, these men used what privilege they had to amplify the cause. There were also sympathetic writers and intellectuals. H.G. Wells, for example, though not always consistent, expressed support for women's political rights and saw suffrage as part of a broader march towards social progress. George Bernard Shaw, never one to miss a chance for provocation, used his sharp wit to point out the hypocrisy of excluding women from politics. In plays, essays, and public speeches, these men helped shift cultural conversations, giving the suffrage cause a veneer of intellectual respectability. Not all male allies were famous, though. Many were ordinary husbands, brothers and fathers who quietly supported the women in their lives. Some marched in demonstrations, others provided financial backing, and many offered moral support at home. These men risked being branded as weak or henpecked, a favourite insult of anti-suffragists who assumed any supportive husband must be under his wife's thumb. In Edwardian pubs, siding with women's suffrage was seen as little short of treason to the Brotherhood. A man who admitted to attending a suffrage rally could expect raised eyebrows, sarcastic jokes, and possibly being cut off from the next round of ale. Still, their support mattered. Having men on the side of the suffragettes undercut the argument that the cause was merely a case of women getting emotional. Male allies forced the establishment to admit that suffrage was not just a fringe demand, but a political issue taken seriously by both sexes. It broadened the conversation and gave suffragettes strategic advantages in Parliament, where only men held seats. Of course, these allies paid a price. They were lampooned in cartoons, accused of betraying their gender, and sometimes physically attacked at rallies. Some politicians dismissed them as outliers or eccentrics, suggesting that supporting women's suffrage was incompatible with serious statesmanship. The Men's League was sneered at as a collection of henpecked husbands, a phrase that told you more about Edwardian sexism than it did about their courage. But despite the mockery, their role was invaluable. They helped challenge the narrative that men were united against women's rights. They lent credibility in political circles where women's voices were systematically excluded, and in some cases, they literally stood between suffragettes and the fists or batons of angry crowds. Their presence didn't dilute the suffrage movement, it strengthened it. Looking back, these men remind us that progress rarely comes from one group alone. The suffragettes led the charge, paid the highest price, and bore the brunt of state repression. But their male allies chipped away at prejudice from another angle, showing that not all men feared equality. They weren't perfect, they didn't endure the same risks of force-feeding or the same social isolation, but they put their reputations on the line in a society where gender loyalty was practically sacred. And if history had to sum up their courage in one wry sentence, it would be this. They risked being called traitors to their gender, which in Edwardian pubs was basically treason. If the suffragettes were loud, determined and unstoppable, their opponents were equally loud, though not always equally logical. Edwardian Britain produced not only women marching in purple, white and green, but also a chorus of critics convinced that giving women the vote would unravel civilization itself. These critics weren't shy. They formed leagues, published pamphlets and filled newspapers with cartoons warning that the country would collapse the moment a woman marked a ballot. According to them, suffrage was less a reform than the beginning of the apocalypse. The Men's League for opposing women's suffrage was one of the most vocal of these groups. Founded in 1908, it gathered gentlemen determined to protect Britain from the supposed chaos of equality. Their mission was to keep politics a strictly male domain. arguing that women's suffrage would lead to disastrous consequences: neglected homes, unruly children, collapsing marriages, and a nation too distracted by sewing circles to defend the empire. Members of the League delivered speeches with straight faces, insisting that Britain could conquer continents but not survive a female voter. The arguments they used now read like parody, but at the time they were presented as solemn truths. One claim was that women were too emotional to vote responsibly. The irony of men shouting angrily about women being too emotional appears to have been lost on them. Another was that women lacked the intellectual capacity to understand complex political matters like foreign policy, despite the fact that many women were already running businesses, schools, and charitable organisations with far more competence than some MPs displayed in Parliament. Cartoons were the weapon of choice for anti-suffrage propaganda. Edwardian magazines like Punch loved to lampoon the idea of women in politics. They depicted suffragettes as ugly, masculine, and humourless, unwomanly women who abandoned their families to chase power. In some cartoons, husbands were shown at home cooking meals and minding children while their wives strode off to Parliament in trousers. The punchline was supposed to be the horror of role reversal. To modern eyes, the joke falls flat, but to Edwardians, the thought of a man doing housework was practically a national crisis. Then there were the pamphlets, little handbooks of alarm. Titles like Why Women Must Not Vote circulated, warning readers that female suffrage would destroy society's moral fabric. Critics claimed women already had indirect influence through their husbands and fathers, so asking for direct political power was greedy. Others argued that women's delicate constitutions made them unfit for the rough-and-tumble world of politics. Apparently, surviving childbirth didn't count as proof of toughness. It wasn't just men either. There were women against women's suffrage, who organised under groups like the National League for Opposing Women's Suffrage. These women argued that political participation would ruin femininity, turn women into neglectful mothers, and upset the natural order. Some sincerely believed that suffrage would harm, not help their sex. Others may have feared social ostracism more than political change. Their presence complicated the debate, giving critics ammunition. If even some women didn't want the vote, why should men grant it? Opposition also had a distinctly imperial flavour. Britain's global dominance was often invoked as a reason not to change anything at home. Politicians warned that suffrage would weaken the empire, as though one woman casting a vote in Manchester would somehow cause India to slip from Britain's grasp. The argument was clear: Britain's power depended on tradition, and tampering with that tradition even slightly would spell doom. Religious leaders joined the chorus too. Sermons thundered that suffrage was against divine will, that women's place was in the home, and that meddling with God's order would invite disaster. Some even claimed that the Bible provided explicit evidence that women should remain silent in politics. Suffragettes responded with their own interpretations of Scripture, but the pulpit was a powerful amplifier for anti-suffrage sentiment. Anti-suffragists also relied heavily on ridicule. They mocked suffragettes' clothing, voices, and even their looks. To oppose suffrage, it seemed, was to reduce women to caricatures, shrill, unfeminine, and laughable. The tactic was effective in some circles. It's easier to dismiss a movement when you turn its leaders into punchlines, but suffragettes often turned the ridicule back on their opponents, pointing out that if democracy could be toppled by a few women in hats, it couldn't have been very sturdy to begin with. Despite the noise, the anti-suffrage movement was fueled less by logic than by fear. Fear that women's votes would shift the balance of politics. Fear that gender roles, carefully enforced for centuries, would begin to blur. Fear that men might lose the absolute authority they had grown comfortable wielding. Beneath all the pearl-clutching rhetoric lay a simple truth. The anti-suffragist movement wasn't about protecting women, it was about protecting male privilege. And yet, for all their speeches, cartoons and pamphlets, the anti-suffragists failed to stop the tide. The louder they shouted that suffrage would end the empire, the more absurd they looked when the empire started crumbling, for reasons that had nothing to do with ballots. History has a wicked sense of humour. The critics warned that women voting would cause Britain's decline, but when the collapse came, it was thanks to world wars, economic crises, and colonial resistance. Not a single checkmark from a suffragette. A con, to phrase it with the biting humour the suffragettes themselves might have enjoyed. According to critics, if women voted, the empire would collapse. Spoiler, it collapsed anyway. By the second decade of the 20th century, the suffrage movement had shifted from noise to fire. sometimes literally. Marches, banners and courtroom speeches had shaken Edwardian Britain, but Parliament still dug in its heels. For some suffragettes, patience finally snapped. If peaceful demonstrations didn't work, and if even hunger strikes could be twisted into government cruelty, then why not take the fight up another notch? Thus began the era of militant escalation, bombings, arson, and the kind of civil disobedience that made even sympathetic supporters blanch. The logic of escalation was simple. If you can't be heard by shouting, try smashing. If smashing doesn't work, try burning. The WSPU, under Emmeline and Pankhurst's leadership, embraced militancy as a deliberate tactic. They argued that polite methods had been tried for decades and failed. Men in history had won rights through rebellion and sometimes through blood. Why, then, should women be expected to remain perpetually well-behaved? The targets chosen were symbolic. Suffragettes rarely aimed at people, but they aimed at the icons of Edwardian privilege, postboxes, churches, empty houses and country estates. Letterboxes were a favourite. They were everywhere, and they represented communication and the smooth running of daily life. By slipping chemicals or explosives into them, suffragettes disrupted ordinary routines, staining letters or reducing correspondence to ashes. To the establishment, it was vandalism. To suffragettes, it was a reminder that Britain's smooth machinery of politics was already broken. Arson became another powerful weapon. Suffragettes set fire to empty buildings, railway stations, and even cricket pavilions. The symbolism was hard to miss. Cricket, golf, and horse racing were the playgrounds of the Edwardian elite. By burning their clubhouses, suffragettes declared, "If women can't play in politics, men don't get to play at all." Even churches were not spared, especially those whose leaders preached against women's suffrage. For the Edwardian public, waking up to charred ruins and suffrage slogans painted on the walls was a jolt they couldn't ignore. Bombings, though less common, sent the strongest message. In 1913, suffragettes planted a bomb in the refreshment pavilion at Westminster Abbey. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the explosion rattled more than the windows. It rattled the nation. Later attacks targeted railway stations and even the homes of politicians. These were not massive acts of terrorism, but carefully calculated disruptions, designed to scare the state into taking the suffragettes seriously. Of course, escalation carried risks. Public opinion, which had wavered between sympathy and scorn, now risked tipping into outright hostility. Some Edwardians, already suspicious of suffrage, seized on the violence as proof that women were too emotional for politics. And, let's be honest, if Edwardian men thought women were too emotional for politics, firebombing a mailbox probably didn't help disprove that theory. The government responded harshly. Police surveillance increased. Raids were conducted on WSPU offices, and suspected militants were hounded. Women carrying suspicious packages were stopped and searched. Some suffragettes went underground, operating in secrecy, moving between safe houses like political fugitives. The state portrayed them as anarchists in skirts, enemies of law and order who threatened the very fabric of Britain. But the suffragettes saw themselves differently. They compared their actions to the struggles of revolutionaries throughout history. Male reformers, they argued, had smashed machines during the Industrial Revolution, fought duels, and even waged armed rebellion. When men used violence, it was called courage. When women set fire to a cricket clubhouse, it was called madness. The double standard only hardened their resolve. The escalation also revealed divisions within the movement. Many suffragists, the more moderate, non-militant activists, worried that violence would alienate public support. Some even broke ties with the WSPU altogether, preferring to continue with lobbying and persuasion. The movement split between those who believed fire and fury were necessary, and those who believed persuasion was the only sustainable path. What cannot be denied, however, is that the militant phase kept suffrage on the front page. Bombings and arson dominated headlines in a way that Tea Party petitions never had. Newspapers might denounce the acts, but they still splashed them across columns, keeping the movement alive in public consciousness. For suffragettes, that visibility was worth the risk. If Parliament wouldn't act out of reason, perhaps it would act out of fear. There's also a tragic irony here. Many of these acts of violence occurred just as Britain stood on the brink of war. Within a year of some of the most destructive suffragette attacks, the nation would face explosions, fires, and destruction on a scale far beyond anything militants had staged. Courtesy of the First World War, the suffragettes' campaign of disruption so shocking in peacetime, would look almost quaint compared to the devastation of actual war. Still, in its moment, the escalation was seismic. Diot turned the suffragette movement from a noisy annoyance into what the government considered a national security threat. For Edwardians who had once dismissed the suffragettes as nagging housewives, the sight of them planting bombs and setting fires was a revelation. These women were not going away quietly. They were willing to risk prison, public scorn, and even their own safety to hammer home their demand, political equality. And so, while some citizens recoiled and others applauded, Britain could no longer pretend that suffrage was a marginal issue. The militant deeds forced the question into the spotlight. If the vote was not granted, how far might this go? That uncertainty was its own kind of pressure, a ticking bomb under the political establishment. Or, to phrase it with a humour sharp enough to cut glass, if Edwardian men thought women were too emotional for politics, firebombing a mailbox probably didn't help disprove that theory. If suffragette militancy had many dramatic moments, one stood above them all in shock and symbolism. Derby Day, 1913. It was here that Emily Wilding Davison, a devoted and fearless activist, staged the protest that would make her name immortal and leave the country stunned. Her act was so audacious, so unexpected, that even the King's horse ended up dragged into politics. Emily Davison was no casual recruit. Born in 1872, she had studied at Oxford, though at the time women weren't even allowed to graduate with degrees, and became a teacher before dedicating herself full-time to the suffrage movement. She was known within the WSPU as daring, even reckless, a woman who would risk anything to push the cause forward. She had been arrested multiple times, force-fed in prison, and even once hid overnight in a cupboard in the House of Commons so she could claim her address for the census as House of Commons, Westminster. A stunt that made headlines. For Davison, politics was not a distant debate. It was a stage where she was willing to gamble her life. By 1913, frustration in the movement was at boiling point. Decades of petitions and protests had achieved nothing. Militancy had escalated to arson and bombings, yet the government remained stubborn. Emily Davison decided that if words and deeds hadn't worked, perhaps a grand gesture would. Derby Day at Epsom Downs, one of the most famous horse races in Britain, and attended by thousands, including King George V himself, was the perfect stage. If the suffragettes wanted attention, there could be no bigger spotlight. On June 4, 1913, crowds thronged the racetrack. The King's horse, Anmer, was among the competitors, ridden by jockey Herbert Jones. The atmosphere was festive, as Derby Day always was, betting, cheering, champagne and fashion on display. But just as the horses thundered past the stands on the final lap, Emily Davison stepped onto the track. What happened next has been debated for over a century. Some argue she intended to die as a martyr. Others believe she planned to attach a suffrage banner to the King's horse to grab headlines. What is certain is that she walked directly into the path of Anmer. The horse collided with her at full speed, hurling both Davison and jockey Jones violently to the ground. Gasps ripped through the crowd. Within seconds, celebration turned to horror. Emily was rushed to hospital with severe head injuries. 4 days later, she died. She was 40 years old. The horse survived. The jockey, badly shaken, would live with the memory for the rest of his life. The incident electrified Britain. Newspapers splashed dramatic headlines. Woman killed at Derby, and suffragette sacrifices life. Photographs and even early film footage of the collision circulated widely. For the first time, cinemagoers could watch the tragedy replayed on screen. It was impossible to look away. Suddenly, suffrage wasn't just marches or broken windows. It was a matter of life and death. Emily's funeral became a vast political statement. The WSPU organised it as a suffragette spectacle. Thousands of women marched behind her coffin, dressed in the movement's colours, purple for dignity, white for purity, and green for hope. Banners were carried high, hymns were sung, and the procession moved through the streets of London like a solemn parade of defiance. Onlookers lined the route, some in sympathy, others in stunned silence. Even opponents admitted the sight was unforgettable. Davison had become a martyr, whether she had intended to or not. The government, predictably, was furious. Officials condemned the act as reckless and dangerous, using it as further proof that suffragette militancy had gone too far. Anti-suffragists crowed that Davison's death showed the movement had lost control, but the suffragettes turned it into a rallying cry. To them, She was a soldier who had fallen in battle, a symbol of how far women were prepared to go to be heard. The ambiguity of her motives only added to her legend. Some evidence suggests she bought a return train ticket, implying she hadn't intended to die. Perhaps she meant only to wave a banner or disrupt the race, not to sacrifice herself. Others argued she knew the risks and embraced them, believing that only a martyr could force the nation to confront the urgency of suffrage. In truth, no one can say for sure, and perhaps that uncertainty is what makes her act resonate so powerfully even today. What is clear is the impact. Emily Davison's fatal protest at Epsom became one of the defining moments of the suffrage struggle. It shocked the public, polarised opinion, and made it impossible to dismiss the movement as a passing nuisance. Whatever she intended, her death ensured that women's fight for the vote was seared into Britain's collective memory. For the suffragettes, Emily Davison was proof of their devotion. For their critics, she was a cautionary tale. For history, she remains a figure of bravery and tragedy, a woman who believed so fiercely in justice that she walked into the path of a galloping horse. Or, to put it with a wry line that captures the absurdity as well as the gravity, her protest was so bold even the horse got dragged into politics. By the early 1910s, Britain's suffrage crisis wasn't just a nuisance, it was a political headache that refused to go away. Parliamentarians might have hoped the movement would fizzle out after a few window smashings, a few marches, and the occasional courtroom spectacle. Instead, it grew louder, angrier, and more impossible to ignore. How did the government respond? With the one tool it knew best: more laws, more arrests, and more repression. Nothing says we're listening like another round of prison sentences. From the state's perspective, suffragette militancy looked less like democracy in action and more like anarchy in bonnets. Prime Minister H. Asquith, bête noire of the movement, was particularly unmoved by arguments for reform. He famously doubted that women either wanted or deserved the vote, and dismissed the growing clamour as a passing fad. Unfortunately for him, the suffragettes weren't fading into the background, they were smashing their way into the headlines. The government's first line of defence was arrest and imprisonment. Every militant deed, whether chaining oneself to a railing or burning down an empty pavilion, ended with women being dragged into police vans. But as we've already seen, prison only turned them into martyrs, especially once hunger strikes and force-feeding entered the picture. Instead of silencing dissent, jail time became a badge of honour. The state had to try something else. That something else was the Cat and Mouse Act of 1913, which we've already met in detail. It was supposed to break the hunger strike cycle by letting suffragettes out when they were weak and hauling them back in once they had recovered. In practice, it made the government look cruel and ridiculous. Watching the state chase women in and out of prison like a bad farce hardly strengthened its reputation. So the government escalated further. Police crackdowns grew harsher. Demonstrations were met with increasingly aggressive responses. Women who tried to march to Parliament found themselves beaten with batons, shoved into paddy wagons, and jeered at by officers who treated the job less as law enforcement and more as sport. The rule of law was beginning to look more like the rule of muscle. Officials also tried restricting public assembly. Permits were denied for rallies, meetings were broken up, and activists found their venues mysteriously closed at the last minute. Police spied on suffrage groups, raided WSPU offices, and seized printing presses. The movement's own paper, Votes for Women, was repeatedly targeted, with authorities desperate to choke off the stream of propaganda. The irony was glaring. In the fight for the vote, women were denied even the freedom of speech. The government even went after leaders personally. Emmeline Pankhurst was arrested multiple times, often dramatically dragged away from rallies, pulled from stages or detained just as she was about to address supporters. Christabel Pankhurst eventually fled to Paris to avoid capture, directing WSPU's strategy from exile. The leadership of the movement was treated like a revolving door of imprisonment, with activists never knowing when they might next be seized. Laws also tightened. The 1912 Criminal Damage Act allowed harsher penalties for vandalism, ensuring that window smashing and arson could carry years of imprisonment rather than mere fines. Women who once expected a few weeks in jail for breaking glass suddenly faced long sentences. The state wanted to raise the stakes to frighten militants into submission. Instead, it hardened their resolve. If you were already willing to risk a few weeks, why not risk a few years? The government also leaned heavily on propaganda of its own. Ministers portrayed suffragettes as terrorists, anarchists, and hysterics. Officials claimed that conceding to such tactics would destroy the rule of law, opening the door for every angry group in Britain to smash and burn their way into political concessions. Behind the bluster, though, was fear. If they gave in to women, would the empire itself seem vulnerable? Yet the crackdown carried risks for the state. The more brutal the response, the more sympathy suffragettes earned. Photos of women bloodied in clashes with police, or accounts of frail activists dragged back to prison under the Cat and Mouse Act, stirred public outrage. Even people who disapproved of militant tactics began questioning whether the government's heavy-handed approach was worse. Meanwhile, the authorities' refusal to compromise created stalemate. The government refused to grant votes under pressure. The suffragettes refused to stop until they won. Each side dug in, and Britain settled into a cycle of escalation. Protest, crackdown, imprisonment, release, repeat. It was a game of political chicken, with neither side willing to blink, and then of course came the looming shadow of war. By 1914, international tensions were spiralling toward conflict, and the suffrage battle, fierce as it was, risked being swept aside by larger crises. But until that moment, the government's policy had remained consistent. No concessions, only punishment. The irony is that the harder the state tried to stamp out the suffragettes, the more indomitable they appeared. Every arrest created headlines, every law revealed the insecurity of those in power, and every crackdown proved the suffragettes' point that Britain's proud democracy wasn't quite as democratic as it liked to claim. Or, to put it with a wink, nothing says we're listening like another round of prison sentences. It's one thing to examine how governments, police, and suffragette leaders clashed. But what about the people who had to live with it all? The shopkeepers whose windows shattered, the servants who worked in households buzzing with suffrage debates, and the everyday Edwardians caught between admiration, annoyance, and utter bewilderment. To them, the suffrage movement wasn't an abstract constitutional debate. It was something that arrived in their shop windows, their letterboxes, and sometimes even their gossip over afternoon tea. For many shopkeepers, the suffragette campaign was a nightmare. When the WSPU launched its coordinated window-smashing raids, high-end stores in London's West End often bore the brunt. Jewellers, dress shops and department stores like Selfridges suddenly found their gleaming displays reduced to shards of glass. Owners complained loudly, not always about politics but about profits. For a small shopkeeper, a broken window wasn't just a nuisance, it was financial ruin until it was repaired. It's no wonder that some grocers and drapers muttered that if women wanted the vote, they should at least leave the haberdashery intact. And yet, even among shopkeepers, reactions varied. Some quietly admired the boldness. Others joked that suffragettes were better for business than sales. After all, smashed windows guaranteed headlines, and curious crowds came to gawk. In a strange way, militant tactics turned the high street into a stage, with shops as unwilling but memorable props. The servant classes, maids, cooks and footmen working in middle and upper-class households, often witnessed suffrage debates from the sidelines. In wealthy homes, mistresses might fund suffrage societies, attend rallies or host drawing-room meetings. Servants, busy laying out teacups and trimming lamps, overheard every heated word. Some found inspiration, others rolled their eyes. For women who worked 16-hour days scrubbing floors, the idea of voting felt both thrilling and absurdly distant. "Lovely, miss. You want votes for women?" one maid might mutter. "But will a ballot box help me with these coal scuttles?" Still, the suffrage movement planted seeds even among those who had little free time to march. For the general public, the reaction was complicated. Crowds at demonstrations often split between supporters and hecklers. At rallies, passers-by sometimes joined in cheers, swept up in the spectacle of banners and speeches. At other times, mobs jeered, spat, and even attacked suffragettes. Newspapers gleefully reported when men dumped flour, rotten eggs, or dead rats onto women holding street corner meetings. To some Edwardians, mocking suffragettes was an afternoon's entertainment, less a political statement, more a chance to vent frustration. Then there were the letterbox attacks, which drove ordinary people absolutely mad. When suffragettes poured acid or ink into mail slots, correspondence came out scorched or illegible. For everyday Britons, this wasn't high politics. It was missing rent notices, ruined love letters, and delayed postcards from Aunt Clara. Many who had no strong opinion about women's votes suddenly found themselves cursing those suffragettes when the post arrived late. Of course, the irony was that postal delays happened long before militancy, but once the WSPU made headlines, every hiccup in the Royal Mail became their fault. Reactions could also be deeply regional and class-based. In industrial towns where working-class women bore the brunt of long hours in factories, there was sympathy for the argument that women deserved a political voice. After all, they were already keeping Britain's economy running. Why shouldn't they shape its laws? But in conservative rural areas, suffragettes were often dismissed as urban troublemakers. Farmers' wives were more likely to hear about smashed shop fronts in London than to meet a suffragette in person, and so the movement could seem alien, distant, and a little bit frightening. Young people, meanwhile, often loved the spectacle. Edwardian teenagers and apprentices, bored of lectures about duty and tradition, sometimes joined suffragette rallies just to watch the chaos. A march through town was more exciting than Sunday school. The humour and energy of suffrage chants stuck in the imagination. For a generation growing up on the edge of modernity, suffragettes were a thrilling sign that change was coming, even if their parents disapproved. It's also worth remembering that many ordinary men were conflicted. They grumbled that suffragettes were destructive, but they also admired their sheer nerve. There was a grudging respect in the way some described them, mad as hatters but brave as lions. In pubs, the debate was as likely to be about tactics as about principle. One man might sneer that women belonged in kitchens, while another admitted, over his pint, that perhaps giving them the vote was better than dealing with more broken glass. And of course, ordinary women watching from the sidelines had mixed feelings. Some feared the militancy made all women look reckless. Others, inspired by the sight of suffragettes defying police, quietly dreamed of joining them. For women stuck in repetitive domestic routines, seeing activists take to the streets was exhilarating. It suggested a different kind of life was possible, a life with voices heard, not just dusting done. By the final years before World War I, the suffragette question wasn't just debated in Parliament or newspapers, it was debated in fish markets, laundries, barbershops and tramcars. Everyone had an opinion, whether informed or not. The movement had achieved something extraordinary. It had made politics a topic of daily conversation. For everyday Edwardians, suffragettes were many things. Brave, annoying, inspiring, disruptive, reckless, heroic. Some cursed them, others cheered them, but few could ignore them. And in that sense, the suffragettes had already won half the battle, by ensuring that even the most ordinary Briton had to think, at least once, about whether women should have the vote, or, to put it with a smile, if your mail was late, you blamed the suffragettes, even if it was just lazy postmen. In the summer of 1914, the suffrage battle in Britain had reached a fever pitch. Windows were still being smashed, postboxes still burned, and the government still responded with arrests and cat-and-mouse repression. Then, almost overnight, the entire fight was shoved aside by something far bigger, World War I. Suddenly, the loudest cries weren't votes for women, but your king and country need you. For all the fire and fury of the suffragette campaign, it was the thunder of artillery in Europe that changed the battlefield. When war broke out, suffrage militancy came to an abrupt halt. The WSPU, led by Emmeline and Pankhurst, stunned many by announcing a suspension of militant activity. Their reasoning was pragmatic. Britain was at war, and internal battles had to wait until the external enemy was defeated. The slogan "Deeds, not words" was swapped for "Win the war," and suffragettes redirected their energy from smashing windows to supporting the war effort. It was as if the curtain fell on one play, and a new, even bloodier production took over the stage. The change wasn't just tactical, it was strategic. By backing the war, suffragettes hoped to prove women's patriotism and strengthen their claim to citizenship. After all, if women could contribute to national survival in wartime, how could the government deny them a political voice in peacetime? This was no surrender, it was a calculated pivot. Emmeline Pankhurst even encouraged young men to enlist. Her rallies now filled not with shouts for the vote but with calls to fight Germany. For a movement once branded as anarchic and unpatriotic, this sudden embrace of national duty was dramatic. Meanwhile, women across Britain poured into wartime roles. With millions of men drafted into the army, someone had to keep the factories humming, the trains running, and the hospitals functioning. Women became munition workers, producing the shells that thundered on the Western Front. They became bus conductors, postwomen, farm labourers, and office clerks. Jobs once considered impossible for the weaker sex were suddenly filled by women, often performed with startling efficiency. Wartime necessity forced society to confront a truth suffragettes had shouted for years. Women could do far more than Edwardian convention allowed. The sight of women in overalls, their hands stained yellow from handling TNT in munitions factories, was both shocking and inspiring. Nicknamed munitionettes, these women became a symbol of Britain's war machine. Newspapers praised their grit, often the same papers that, only months earlier, had mocked suffragettes as hysterical window breakers. The irony was delicious. War had done what decades of petitions could not. It made women's contribution to the nation visible and undeniable. Not all suffrage groups reacted the same way. The WSPU threw itself into the war effort wholeheartedly, but Sylvia Pankhurst and other socialist-leaning activists criticised the pivot. Sylvia, true to her principles, argued that the war was a tragedy of empire and that women's suffrage should not be set aside. She continued campaigning for peace and social justice, putting her at odds with her mother and sister. Once again, the Pankhurst family became a microcosm of the movement's divisions. For the government, the war was both a relief and a challenge. On one hand, the suffragette threat evaporated. No more bombs or arson attacks to embarrass ministers. On the other hand, the war highlighted the absurdity of denying women political rights while depending on them to keep the country functioning. Ministers could hardly argue that women were too delicate for politics when women were working with explosives, ploughing fields and driving trams. The public reaction shifted too. Ordinary Edwardians who once muttered about those suffragettes now found themselves shoulder to shoulder with women on the factory floor or in queues at wartime ration shops. While hostility didn't vanish overnight, respect began to grow. Women weren't just wives and mothers anymore. They were part of the war machine, and that demanded recognition. Yet the suspension of militancy didn't mean suffrage was forgotten. Far from it. Women's contributions during the war became ammunition for the political battle to come. Suffragette leaders were keenly aware that their wartime service was building a moral debt the government could not ignore. When the guns eventually fell silent, the question would no longer be, should women vote? But how can you possibly deny it now? Of course, this wasn't obvious in 1914. At the time, Britain was too busy mobilising against Germany to worry about political reform at home. The suffrage struggle had been shoved into the background, temporarily eclipsed by war, but in a strange way, the war was doing the suffragettes' work for them. By necessity, it proved their case. Women were capable, adaptable, and essential to the nation's survival. The irony is almost too perfect. For years, anti-suffragists had claimed that women's votes would bring down the empire. Then came a global war, and the empire nearly did collapse, but not because women wanted ballots. It was saved, in part because women rolled up their sleeves and kept it alive while men were at the front. Or, to put it with a bit of Edwardian bite, nothing unites people like realising the enemy is Germany, not women with banners. When Britain plunged into the Great War in 1914, the suffrage banners were rolled up, but the fight for women's equality didn't vanish. It simply moved to new front lines. While men marched off to muddy trenches in France and Belgium, women stepped into jobs and roles once deemed unthinkable. Edwardian society had long insisted that women were too fragile for politics, too delicate for hard labour, too emotional for responsibility. Yet war quickly demolished those illusions. It turned out women could handle heavy machinery and explosives just fine, better than most politicians handled paperwork. The most iconic of these wartime roles was munition work. As millions of men joined the army, factories that produced bullets, shells and bombs desperately needed workers. Enter the munitionettes, women who swapped corsets for overalls and filled the assembly lines. They worked with TNT and other dangerous chemicals, sometimes with little protective equipment. Their skin often turned yellow from prolonged exposure, earning them the nickname Canary Girls. It wasn't glamorous, and it was certainly risky. Explosions were a constant threat, but it was vital. Without them, the army's guns would have fallen silent. The symbolism was powerful. For decades, anti-suffragists claimed women couldn't be trusted with responsibility. Now they were literally producing the ammunition that kept Britain in the war. A government that refused them ballots depended on them to manufacture bullets. It was hypocrisy so glaring that even cynics noticed. Suffragettes, temporarily suspending militancy, gleefully pointed out that if women could handle dynamite, surely they could handle democracy. But factory work was just one piece of the puzzle. Women also filled gaps in transportation. They became bus and tram conductors, ticket collectors, and even drivers. Londoners who once expected their fares to be clipped by uniformed men suddenly found cheerful young women in their place, uniforms neatly pressed, whistles at the ready. It was shocking at first, but soon accepted. Wartime necessity had a way of erasing tradition. On farms, too, women stepped in. The Women's Land Army, created to address food shortages, recruited thousands to plough fields, plant crops, and tend livestock. For many, it was their first time out of the cities, their first time handling ploughs instead of teapots. Farmers, initially sceptical, were forced to admit that women could manage a field as well as a kitchen, and in muddy boots and headscarves, these women looked nothing like the delicate Edwardian ladies caricatured in anti-suffrage cartoons. Another crucial role was nursing. Women served in hospitals at home and in field stations near the front. The most famous were the nurses of the Voluntary Aid Detachments, VADs, who tended to the wounded under brutal conditions. Others drove ambulances across shell-pocked roads, dodging artillery fire to deliver soldiers to care. They dressed wounds, comforted the dying, and faced horrors that many politicians back in Westminster would have fainted at the sight of. If politics was deemed too rough for women, nursing during the Great War proved that women could face roughness on a scale men could scarcely imagine. Women also entered clerical and professional work in unprecedented numbers. With so many men in uniform, government offices, banks, and businesses needed staff. Women filled those gaps, typing reports, balancing accounts, and keeping the machinery of state and commerce running. It was here that middle-class women in particular found new opportunities, discovering independence and salaries they had never known. For some, it was intoxicating, a taste of autonomy that would not be surrendered easily once peace returned. Of course, these roles didn't erase inequality overnight. Women were often paid less than men for the same work. Supervisors sometimes treated them as temporary placeholders, not serious employees. And when men returned from the war, many women were pushed out of their jobs, but the genie was out of the bottle. Millions of people had now seen women operate lathes, drive tractors, and manage hospital wards. The idea that women were inherently unsuited to responsibility was impossible to maintain with a straight face. Public attitudes began to shift. Ordinary people who had once scoffed at suffragettes found themselves depending on women to keep daily life functioning. Trains ran because women drove them. Crops grew because women planted them. Letters arrived because women sorted them. And soldiers returned alive because women had patched their wounds. The suffrage question hadn't vanished. It had transformed. The battlefield was now factories, farms and hospitals, and women were proving their worth in every one. Key leaders were keenly aware of the propaganda value. Emmeline Pankhurst toured factories and hospitals, praising women's contributions. The WSPU plastered posters with slogans linking war service to citizenship. The argument was no longer abstract. If women had worked for the survival of the nation, they deserved political recognition when the war ended. The irony was sharp. Before the war, opponents of suffrage insisted women should stick to domestic duties. During the war, those same women became essential to public life. While many men's duties were to sit in trenches waiting for orders, the contrast could not have been clearer. By 1918, Britain was a changed nation. The war had devastated millions, but it had also shattered the rigid boundaries of Edwardian gender roles. The suffrage battle was not over, but the battlefield had shifted irrevocably. Women had proven in the most unforgiving circumstances that they could shoulder responsibility as well as any man. Or, to put it with a wink, turns out women could handle heavy machinery and explosives just fine, better than most politicians handled paperwork. By 1918, Britain was exhausted. 4 years of total war had chewed through lives, landscapes and illusions about the permanence of Edwardian society. The trenches had redrawn the map of Europe, but they also reshaped the boundaries of British democracy. When the guns finally fell silent, politicians could no longer deny what suffragettes had shouted, starved and even died for. Women had proven their worth to the nation. Reform was inevitable, and so came the Representation of the People Act of 1918, a landmark moment, though one that carried both triumph and compromise. On the surface, the act was revolutionary. For the first time in British history, women were legally allowed to vote in parliamentary elections. The struggle that had seen broken windows, hunger strikes, and Emily Davison's fatal protest had finally forced Parliament's hand. Suffragettes could at last enter polling stations, pencils in hand, and mark their say on the nation's future. The ballot box was no longer a men-only club, but there was a catch, or several. The vote was not extended to all women. Instead, the Act allowed voting for women over the age of 30, and only if they met property qualifications. In other words, you could now vote, but only if you were old enough to be respectable and had enough money to prove you wouldn't use your ballot irresponsibly. Younger women, the ones who had filled factories, driven trams, and patched up soldiers on the battlefield, were excluded. It was equality. Yes, but equality with conditions. Or, to put it another way, you could vote at 30, but only if you owned property. Basically equality, but with a mortgage. The reasoning behind the restrictions was political arithmetic. If all women had suddenly been enfranchised, they would have outnumbered men, many of whom had been killed in the war. The government balked at the idea of a female majority electorate overnight, so they compromised. Older women, assumed to be more conservative, calmer, and less likely to set postboxes on fire, were brought in first. It was reform designed to change the system without terrifying it. Even with its limits, the Act transformed the electorate. Approximately 8.4 million women gained the vote, a staggering expansion of political participation. At the same time, the Act also enfranchised millions of working-class men who had previously been excluded for not meeting property requirements. In that sense, it was less a victory solely for women than a broad reshaping of British democracy. But for the suffrage movement, it was the breakthrough they had fought for, a legal recognition that women had the right to shape the state. The reactions were mixed. Suffragettes celebrated, marching proudly with banners declaring victory. The WSPU renamed its newspaper from Votes for Women to Britannia, a sign that the battle had been won, or at least mostly won. Yet there was frustration too. Many young women who had served during the war were furious at being excluded. Imagine being 28 years old, having worked in a munitions factory for 4 years handling explosives, only to be told you were too immature to vote. One wonders how many ballot papers would have had "really" scrawled across them in protest. For leaders like Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, the Act was vindication. They could point to decades of struggle and finally say it worked. Their militancy, their hunger, their sacrifices had not been in vain. But for others, especially Sylvia Pankhurst and more radical activists, it was bittersweet. The vote was progress, yes, but the class and age restrictions revealed just how cautiously Britain approached reform. Full equality was still a decade away. Politically, the impact was immediate. Women over 30 began voting in the general election of December 1918, the so-called khaki election. It was the first time polling stations saw long lines of women alongside men, their names finally printed on the rolls. Some brought children along, turning the act of voting into a family event. Newspapers printed photographs of respectable matrons proudly casting ballots, as if to reassure the nervous that democracy had not collapsed overnight. Spoiler, the roof of Parliament did not cave in just because a woman ticked a box. The Act also allowed women to stand for Parliament. Within months, Constance Markievicz, an Irish revolutionary, became the first woman elected to the House of Commons, though as a Sinn Féin MP she refused to take her seat. The following year, Nancy Astor would become the first woman actually to sit in Parliament, paving the way for female voices in the very chamber that had once jeered suffragette protests. The dock was no longer the only platform available to them. It's tempting to see 1918 as the end of the story, the neat finale where justice prevailed. But in truth, it was more of a halfway house. Millions of women still had no vote, and full suffrage wouldn't come until 1928. Still, in the context of centuries of exclusion, the Representation of the People Act was a seismic shift. It cracked open the door to equality, even if it didn't fling it wide. For ordinary Edwardians, the change was both strange and mundane. The newspapers made a fuss, politicians made speeches, but for most voters, Election Day in 1918 went smoothly. The world didn't end. Civilization didn't collapse. The empire didn't dissolve. That came later for entirely unrelated reasons. Life went on, but now women were finally part of the official democratic process. Or, as history might phrase it with a smirk, you could vote at 30, but only if you owned property, basically equality, but with a mortgage. By the time the Representation of the People Act of 1918 cracked open the door to women's suffrage, the Edwardian world that birthed the Suffragettes was already gone. The war had redrawn society, and the militant protests of the pre-1914 years became part of a larger story, a story of transformation that didn't end with a single law, but echoed through decades. The suffragette legacy is not just about votes, it's about the way they redefined politics, gender, and the very idea of citizenship. The first and most obvious legacy is rights. While 1918 enfranchised only some women, the eventual victory came in 1928, when women finally gained the vote on the same terms as men. It took 10 more years, but the dam had been breached in 1918, and the pressure never stopped. Once women had been admitted into polling stations, it was impossible to justify keeping half the population excluded. The vote, once granted to a few, became a universal expectation. Yet the legacy runs deeper than ballots. Suffragettes showed that protest could be theatrical, disruptive, and unapologetically bold. They pioneered tactics that later movements would adopt: civil disobedience, hunger strikes, visual spectacle, and media-savvy stunts. From the civil rights movement to climate activism, echoes of suffragette strategies can be seen whenever protesters chain themselves to gates, march in coordinated colours, or use their own bodies as political statements. They turned protest from quiet petition into performance art, and the script has been reused ever since. They also changed the way society thought about women's capabilities. Before suffrage, women were imagined as fragile ornaments fit for salons and nurseries, not public debate. After suffrage, that myth was permanently shattered. Women had chained themselves to railings, endured prison brutality, and in wartime filled factories and hospitals. They had proven that the weaker sex was perfectly capable of strength, resilience, and leadership. Without that shift, later battles for equal pay, reproductive rights, workplace equality would have been far harder to fight. There's also the cultural memory of the suffragettes. Their imagery, purple, white, and green banners, women marching in long skirts, dramatic arrests, is iconic. Films, books, and plays revisit their story, sometimes romanticizing, sometimes critiquing, but always recognizing its importance. The suffragette became not just a political activist, but a cultural archetype. Determined, fearless, a little dangerous. When people today talk about breaking glass ceilings, they are invoking that spirit, even if they don't realize it. Or, as we might say with a grin, the suffragettes broke windows so we could break glass ceilings, one pane at a time. But legacy is rarely simple. The suffrage movement itself was not perfect. Its victories were often shaped by class. Wealthier women gained the vote earlier, while working-class women waited longer. Some suffragettes used rhetoric that excluded or marginalised women of colour, both in Britain and across the Empire. These tensions remind us that the movement was both revolutionary and imperfect. The legacy is not just triumph, but also a lesson in inclusivity, one still relevant today. The political system also changed because of them. Once women became voters, politicians could no longer afford to ignore their concerns. Issues like education, healthcare, child welfare, and housing gained prominence on the political agenda, in part because women voters demanded them. The electorate expanded not just in size, but in scope. British politics became broader, more representative, and more attuned to everyday life beyond the clubrooms of Westminster. Even their opponents, in time, helped solidify their legacy. The pearl clutchers who once insisted that suffrage would collapse the empire were proved wrong, and spectacularly so. The empire collapsed anyway for reasons that had nothing to do with women in polling booths. Their dire warnings became, in hindsight, the best advertisement for progress. Suffragettes had been right. Extending democracy strengthened Britain, it didn't weaken it. Perhaps the most lasting legacy, though, is psychological. The suffragettes taught future generations that rights are not gifted politely. They are fought for, loudly and persistently. Their defiance became a model for all who came after, that if authority refuses to listen, you make yourself impossible to ignore. It's a lesson that resonates in every march, every protest, every demand for justice since. Today, statues stand where once only jeers echoed. Parliament Square itself now includes the likeness of Millicent Fawcett, holding a banner with the words "Courage calls to courage" everywhere. Emily Davison is remembered as a martyr, Emmeline Pankhurst as a pioneer. Their names are etched into schoolbooks, their faces into documentaries, their fight into the DNA of modern democracy. The Edwardians, who mocked them as hysterics or unwomanly, could not have imagined how thoroughly they would rewrite history. The Suffragettes did not just win votes, they redefined what it meant to be a citizen, a protester, and a woman in the modern world. Their legacy is not fragile, not quaint, and not confined to the past. It is alive in every demand for equality, every ballot cast, every challenge to systems that would prefer silence. And so the story that began with smashed windows, shouted speeches, and prison cells ends with something far more enduring, a world where women's voices are part of itself. Or, as the suffragettes might have chuckled if they could see us now, they broke windows so we could break glass ceilings, one pane at a time.